This is a compilation of over 3 hours of the complete Resident Evil timeline explained, so sit back, relax, and grab your popcorn. Let's kick things off with the complete Resident Evil timeline. The Resident Evil franchise has been telling one continuous story of biological horror for almost 30 years, and the full timeline is absolutely unhinged. We're talking aristocratic eugenicists, secret military deals, parasitic cults, cities nuked off the map, and a fungal hive mind that ties it all together. This is the complete Resident Evil timeline, every major event explained. And it starts with 3 rich guys who went on a hiking trip and brought back the end of the world. The 1960s to 1970s, Umbrella's foundations. Here's the thing about Umbrella Corporation. It wasn't built by mad scientists in a secret bunker. It was built by 3 wealthy university classmates who bonded over a shared interest in eugenics. Oswell E. Spencer, Dr. Edward Ashford, and Dr. James Marcus, 3 old money aristocrats convinced they could engineer a superior human race. That's how the deadliest corporation in gaming history started, a philosophy club with a trust fund. But what turned their ambitions from theoretical to terrifyingly real was a flower. In 1966, Marcus theorized that a West African plant called the Stairway of the Sun had mutagenic properties capable of rewriting human biology. So he traveled to the Indapaya tribal lands, found an underground garden hidden beneath ancient ruins, and in December 1966, isolated what would become known as the progenitor virus. Spencer saw the potential immediately, but not just for science. He struck a secret deal with the US military to produce progenitor-based biological weapons, while transforming Umbrella from a rich man's science project into a global bioweapons manufacturer hiding behind pharmaceutical sales. But here's where the darkness kicks in early. Dr. Edward Ashford died in 1968, killed by his own prototype T-virus. Officially an accident. Unofficially, Spencer almost certainly orchestrated it to seize full control. The man murdered his co-founder within 2 years of launch. And the twisted irony is that Ashford's death actually accelerated the T-virus project, because Spencer used the tragedy to consolidate all research under his direct oversight. By the early 1980s, Umbrella's Arklay laboratory had become the company's crown jewel, pioneering bioorganic weapons. What started as 3 aristocrats with a dangerous hobby was now a multinational empire with military contracts, secret labs, and a body count that was only just getting started. And that Arklay laboratory, it's about to become ground zero for the single worst night in survival horror history. July 1998, Arklay Mountains / Spencer's Cleanup. The most famous haunted house in gaming history exists because one man decided destroying evidence was easier than actually cleaning up his mess. On May 11th, 1998, a containment accident at the Arklay laboratory released the T-virus into the Spencer mansion. Not into a city, not into the open air, into a single building hidden deep in the Arklay Mountains, and for 2 full months, nobody outside Umbrella knew it was happening. But here's where it gets disturbing. During those 2 months, the infection crept through the mansion like a slow tide. Lab staff stopped reporting for shifts. Researchers who were alive on Monday were eating their co-workers by Friday. The MA-39 Cerberus bioweapons, T-virus infected dogs, broke containment and started hunting through Raccoon Forest, attacking hikers, campers, anyone unlucky enough to be in the woods. And Umbrella's response to all of this was to cover it up. Meetings were held, memos were written, bodies piled up. Corporate kept the lights off and hoped it would burn itself out. It didn't. By the time the dust settled, 127 people were dead. 78 Umbrella employees, 23 test subjects, 20 civilians from Raccoon City, and 7 Raccoon Police Department officers. But here's the part that changes everything about how you read this story. On July 25, 1998, Oswell Spencer authorized the demolition of the entire Arklay laboratory and Spencer mansion, not to contain the virus, to destroy evidence of Umbrella's illegal bioweapons program. He sent STARS in to do it. And there's a strong fan theory that Spencer had a second motive. He wasn't just using STARS to blow the place up, he was using them as lab rats, collecting live combat data on how T-virus specimens performed against trained military operatives. The company watched its own police force get hunted through hallways full of monsters and took notes. The worst part? Spencer's solution was catastrophically counterproductive. The demolition released concentrated viral specimens into the surrounding environment and left behind survivors who had seen everything. Umbrella didn't bury the problem. They scattered it across an entire region. And if you think that's bad, wait until you see what happened when that virus reached Raccoon City 2 months later. September to October, 1998, Raccoon City destruction. Every disaster in this timeline traces back to one man making one selfish decision. Dr. William Birkin spent years developing the G-virus for Umbrella. a pathogen capable of repairing dead tissue and theoretically creating superhumans. It was the most valuable bioweapon on the planet, but when Umbrella moved to take it from him, Birkin panicked and tried to sell his research to the US military instead. Bad move? Umbrella had a mole embedded inside the military, and the second Birkin's betrayal was flagged, they sent an execution squad to kill him. But here's where the domino chain starts, because Birkin didn't just die. He survived long enough to inject himself with G-virus samples, us mutating into a monstrous chimera that barely resembled anything human. Then, in what was either a final act of spite or pure desperation, he smashed open the remaining virus briefcases in the underground lab. That contaminated Raccoon City's entire sewage and water infrastructure. The T-virus spread through the pipes, into the taps, into the population. And Umbrella's response made everything worse. They deployed weaponized BOWs throughout the city to contain the outbreak, which is like fighting a house fire by throwing more fire at it. The creatures introduced additional infected vectors into civilian neighborhoods, accelerating transmission at a rate nobody could control. By September 24th, 1998, the Pentagon had boots on the ground, telling the media it was a radioactive leak. The government imposed martial law and set up highway checkpoints, locked the city down, but it was already too late. Hundreds of infected residents had slipped out before the perimeter was established. On October 1st, 1998, President Clinton authorized Operation Eradication, a thermobaric missile strike that obliterated Raccoon City and killed an estimated 100,000 people, infected and uninfected alike. The American government nuked its own civilians, but here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. The US government already knew about the T-virus. They had a contractual relationship with Umbrella, they had foreknowledge of the bioweapons, and after they bombed 100,000 of their own citizens, they classified everything, specifically to prevent China from accessing effective bioweapon construction protocols. They didn't cover it up because they were ashamed. They covered it up because the research was still valuable. One scientist's betrayal led to a corporate hit squad, which led to a contaminated water supply, which led to a zombie city, which led to the government erasing 100,000 lives, and then lying about why. Every single decision made the situation worse, and nobody was held accountable for any of it. But if Raccoon City was the moment the world should have woken up to what Umbrella had created, what happened 2 months later proved that the nightmare was just getting started. December 1998, Rockfort Island/Antarctic incident. So Raccoon City is a smoking crater. Umbrella is hemorrhaging personnel, assets, and credibility. And the brilliant solution their surviving operatives came up with: ship everything to a remote island in the South Pacific. Prisoners, viral samples, infected specimens, all of it, crammed onto transports headed for Rockfort Island, Umbrella's paramilitary headquarters, and, because subtlety was never their strong suit, a literal concentration camp facility. But here's where it gets complicated. Umbrella wasn't just collapsing from the outside, it was being looted from within. In December 1998, the HCF, Umbrella's own quasi-independent security division, launched a full-scale infiltration of Rockfort Island. Their target was the T. veronica virus, a progenitor strain developed by Dr. Alexia Ashford that could do something no other virus in Umbrella's arsenal had managed. Let infected hosts keep their minds, cognitive function intact, superhuman transformation included. That kind of research was worth more than the island itself, but the raid went sideways fast. During the chaos of the HCF operation, T-virus containment failed across the entire facility. Prisoners, guards, paramilitary personnel, all converted into undead within hours. And the evacuation plan? Remote-controlled carrier planes ferried surviving Umbrella staff to Antarctic research stations. Nobody checked whether those evacuees were infected. Nobody screened the cargo. They just launched planes toward one of the most isolated places on Earth and hoped for the best. They did not get the best. The outbreak spread to Antarctic personnel who had zero knowledge they were standing in a biohazard zone. But the real gut punch is who orchestrated the whole thing: Albert Wesker. Umbrella's top security operative wasn't running a rescue. He wasn't even running damage control. He was systematically extracting viral research data and funneling it to third-party buyers. The HCF infiltration, the evacuation flights, the Antarctic transfer, all of it functioned as one massive intelligence theft operation disguised as institutional chaos. And that's the real horror of December 1998. Raccoon City's destruction didn't end the bioweapon crisis. It shattered it into pieces. Viral materials scattered across the globe, infected specimens moving between continents, and rogue operatives like Wesker operating with zero oversight and every reason to keep the chaos going, there was no centralized authority tracking any of it. But if you think an unmonitored global bioweapon diaspora sounds bad, wait until a South American drug lord gets his hands on one of those scattered viral strains. 2002, South American Operation Javier Hidalgo Incident. 4 years after Raccoon City got nuked off the map, the threat landscape shifted in a way nobody saw coming. It wasn't a corporation running bioweapons anymore. It was a heartbroken drug lord in the Amazon with a briefcase full of T-virus and a vendetta. Javier Hidalgo ran the Amparo region of the Amazon rainforest like his personal kingdom, part cartel, part warlord operation. But the guy wasn't some cartoonish villain. He was a father watching his daughter die. Manuela Hidalgo had a degenerative illness that no conventional treatment could touch. Javier was desperate enough to deal with anyone who promised a cure, and the person who showed up was Albert Wesker. While Umbrella was collapsing in on itself like a dying star, Wesker was moonlighting as a pharmaceutical sales rep for a rival bioweapons company. His pitch? The T. Veronica virus as experimental medicine. The insane part is it actually worked. Manuela's condition stabilized, but the treatment turned her into a viral superhuman whose blood carried natural T. Veronica antibodies. She wasn't just cured, she became the single most valuable biological specimen on the planet. Then Javier lost track of her. He became convinced Umbrella had taken Manuela or killed her, and that conviction turned a grieving father into a bioterrorist. He deliberately released T-virus across the Amparo region, killing hundreds of innocent people in an act of vengeance against a corporation that was already basically dead, the US. As government responded by deploying the Anti-Umbrella Pursuit and Investigation Team under Antivirus Weapon Protocol number 7600, the first dedicated unit built specifically to handle Umbrella-derived bioterrorism. This was the moment the world officially acknowledged that the post-Umbrella era wasn't safer. It was worse. Anyone with black market connections and enough rage could get their hands on a world-ending pathogen. But here's where it gets genuinely painful. During the operation, they found Manuela alive. Javier's daughter had been there the whole time. The reunion should have been a relief, but the US government immediately placed her in permanent federal protective custody. Her antibodies were too valuable. She wasn't a daughter anymore. She was a research asset. Fans still argue about whether Javier is a monster or a desperate father dealt the worst hand imaginable. The honest answer is probably both. He killed hundreds of people for a daughter who was alive, and now the government owns her. But if the Javier incident proved that Umbrella's legacy could turn anyone into a bioterrorist, what happened next proved that Umbrella itself still had one final breath left in it. 2003, Umbrella's final collapse. Picture this: 3 separate armies fighting inside an active bioweapons research facility, and somehow that's not even the most absurd part of how Umbrella ends. In February 2003, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine finally got what they'd been working toward for 5 years. They led a multinational strike force straight into Umbrella Russia. A clandestine research lab disguised as a decommissioned chemical plant kept running through backroom barter deals with Eastern European governments who wanted access to bioweapon tech. This was the last operational Umbrella facility on the planet. The mission was called Umbrella's End, and on paper, it should have been the triumphant finale to half a decade of fighting. But when Chris and Jill's forces breached the facility, Albert Wesker was already inside. He'd arrived with his own private army, completely independent of the international operation, and he wasn't there to destroy anything. He was there to steal. Wesker wanted Umbrella's supercomputer research archives, their viral weaponization protocols, every scrap of data he could extract before the whole place came down. Therefore, the assault devolved into a 3-way war to international military forces fighting Umbrella's automated defense systems and remaining loyalists, while Wesker's private operatives moved through the chaos, grabbing hard drives and research files like it was a clearance sale at the end of the world. And Wesker got what he came for. He successfully extracted significant portions of Umbrella's research archives before the facility was destroyed. But here's where it gets bitter. This wasn't a last-minute heist. Wesker had spent the entire period from 1998 to 2003 systematically looting Umbrella from the inside, stealing viral samples, recruiting specialized personnel, siphoning research data, building an independent bioweapon capability that rivaled entire nation-states. By the time Chris and Jill showed up for the grand finale, Wesker had already hollowed the corporation out like a parasite. And then there's Spencer. Oswell E. Spencer, the founding chairman of Umbrella, the man who started literally all of this, was assassinated by Wesker earlier that same year. Not in some dramatic showdown, not in a burning laboratory. The man who built a global bioweapons empire and orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people died in a chair. Wesker killed him and took what was left of his legacy. Symbolic doesn't even begin to cover it, so yes, Umbrella was officially destroyed. The corporation ceased to exist, but its intellectual property, viral strains, and research protocols had already scattered through black market channels so thoroughly that the threat didn't just survive the corporation's death, it metastasized. The world was somehow more dangerous after Umbrella fell than when it was still running, and that new, more dangerous world was about to introduce a threat that had nothing to do with viruses at all. 2004, Los Illuminados cult/rural Spain incident. Up until this point, every single bioweapon in this timeline has been a virus. T-virus, G-virus, T-Veronica, it doesn't matter. They all work the same way. Infect the host, destroy higher brain function, turn them into something mindless and violent. The result is always zombies, monsters, or some grotesque combination of both. But in 2004, something completely different crawled out of a castle basement in rural Spain, and it changed everything. Los Illuminados was a religious cult operating in the Valdelobos region, a remote mountain area so isolated from modern Spain that it might as well have existed in a different century. They claimed to be the continuation of an ancient primal religion predating recorded history, and their weapon of choice wasn't a virus at all. It was Las Plagas, a neurotrophic parasite of extreme antiquity capable of hijacking the human nervous system while leaving the host partially functional. Here's where it gets unsettling. Infected humans, called ganados, could still pick up weapons. They could work in coordinated groups, they could follow orders and communicate with each other. The T-virus made mindless corpses that stumbled toward noise. Las Plagas made an army you could command. The man who unleashed them was Ramon Salazar, the 8th Castellan of Salazar Castle, who was manipulated by cult leader Osmond Sadler into opening sealed caverns beneath his family's estate. Salazar agreed to release fossilized Las Plagas specimens that had been locked underground for potentially thousands of years, framing it as atonement for his ancestors' sins against the faith. He cracked open a tomb that his entire bloodline had spent generations keeping shut. The parasites existed in multiple developmental stages. Early stage organisms stayed dormant inside hosts, quietly establishing nervous system control. But mature specimens could achieve independent mobility after leaving the host body entirely, with some variants undergoing full morphological transformation into combat-capable creatures that operated without any host at all. But here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. Which underground murals discovered in those same caverns depicted the Ndapaya civilization, the same prehistoric people connected to the naturally occurring progenitor virus in West Africa, apparently weaponizing Las Plagas thousands of years ago. Two completely separate civilizations on two different continents with zero shared knowledge, both independently discovered biological warfare and built weapons out of it before recorded history even began, and Los Illuminados achieved parasite weaponization comparable to Umbrella's viral engineering without a single piece of modern laboratory equipment, no billion-dollar research facilities, no government contracts, just a cult, a castle, and something ancient that should have stayed buried. If that tonal shift feels jarring, good, because the timeline is about to get even stranger when bioterrorism hits a floating city in the Mediterranean. 2004 to 2005. Terra Grigia Panic and Queen Zenobia Incident. Picture a floating city in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Terra Grigia was built as a showcase for humanity's best impulses, a self-sustaining aquapolis powered by advanced solar energy technology, funded by international cooperation, and designed to prove that large-scale renewable infrastructure could actually work. It was beautiful, it was ambitious, and in September 2004, bioterrorists burned it to the ground. The attack came from Il Veltro, a militant organization that opposed Terra Grigia's environmental mission. Their weapon of choice was the T-Abyss virus, a progenitor-derived pathogen engineered in 2003 specifically for aquatic transmission. This thing wasn't like the T-virus. It didn't just infect people. It contaminated entire marine ecosystems, spreading through water systems and into the surrounding Mediterranean with zero realistic containment options. Il Veltro deployed T-Abyss through Terra Grigia's water infrastructure, and within days the floating city was a graveyard, thousands dead, the city abandoned permanently. But here's where it gets so much worse. In 2005, a biological outbreak hit a set of Mediterranean cruise ships, the Queen Zenobia among them, all deliberately infected with the T-Abyss. The investigation into that outbreak cracked open the entire Terra Grigia conspiracy, and what it revealed was genuinely sickening. The man running the international response to the Terra Grigia panic, Federal Bioterrorism Commission Commissioner Morgan Lansdale, was the one who orchestrated the attack in the first place. Lansdale personally personally arranged for Il Veltro to hit Terra Grigia. He manufactured the crisis to generate public terror, then positioned his agency as the only institution capable of responding to it. He maintained exclusive control over the T-Abis vaccine, turning it into a political weapon he could hold over national governments. Need the cure? Better expand the FBC's budget. Better give Lansdale more authority. The man ostensibly protecting the world from bioterrorism was the bioterrorist. He's more disturbing than most Resident Evil villains because there's nothing supernatural about him. No mutations, no god complex, no ancient parasites. Just a bureaucrat who killed thousands of people to grow his department. But here's the satisfying irony. Then Lansdale's entire strategy depended on monopolizing bioweapon fear, on being the only player in the game. That fell apart when Neo Umbrella demonstrated independent T-virus weapon capability completely outside governmental control. Lansdale's monopolization hadn't prevented proliferation. It had accelerated it by creating demand among non-state actors desperate for defensive capabilities against the very governmental programs he was running. He created the exact nightmare he claimed to be preventing. The FBC was dismantled after Lansdale's exposure, triggering a complete reorganization of international bioterrorism response. But if institutional corruption within the agencies fighting bioterror sounds bad, wait until you see what happens when a multinational corporation decides to run human experiments across an entire African region. 2009, Kijuju Autonomous Zone outbreak. Umbrella died in 2003. The logo changed, the ethics didn't. Starting in the summer of 2008, Tricell Inc., a Fortune 500 multinational corporation, set up shop in the Kijuju region of West Africa. They rolled in with medical outreach programs, free clinics, the whole humanitarian package. But behind every clinic door was a Las Plagas weaponization lab. Tricell recruited impoverished local residents as test subjects, people who thought they were receiving vaccinations or basic health care. They weren't. They were being injected with parasites. This wasn't some rogue scientist operating out of a basement. This was a publicly traded corporation running non-consensual human experimentation on African populations under the cover of pharmaceutical aid. The exact same playbook Umbrella used for decades, just with better branding and a corporate social responsibility page on their website. But here's where it gets worse. When the Ye Nationalist movement, a local independence faction, seized Tricell's research facilities, they didn't shut the experiments down, they weaponized them. The Ye leadership deliberately infected hundreds of Kijuju residents with Las Plagas to build an irregular military force capable of overwhelming government troops and securing regional autonomy. These infected soldiers, called Majini, retained enough cognitive function to use weapons and coordinate tactically, but they hit harder, moved faster, and shrugged off injuries that would drop a normal human. The West African Las Plagas strains produced more aggressive transformations than anything documented in Spain 5 years earlier, suggesting Tricell had been deliberately engineering the parasites for enhanced combat performance before losing control of the program. The BSAA deployed Chris Redfield and Shiva Alomar to lead the response. What followed was approximately 8 months of sustained combat, the longest and most costly bioterrorism response operation on record. The casualty rate among BSAA operators was devastating. The majority of personnel deployed to Kijuju didn't come home. But the real discovery wasn't the Majini. It was what they found inside Tricell's facilities. The investigation uncovered a continental-scale bioweapons smuggling network. Tricell had been coordinating with governments, private military contractors, and organized crime syndicates across multiple continents to traffic weaponized biological agents. This wasn't a rogue operation hidden in a jungle somewhere. This was infrastructure. Supply chains, contracts, post-Umbrella bioweapon proliferation hadn't just survived the corporation's death, it had gone fully mainstream, integrated into the operations of a company with shareholders and quarterly earnings calls. Umbrella built the market. Tricell proved anyone with enough money could run it, and the next incident would prove that even isolated islands weren't safe from what came next. 2011, Sin Island / Sushestvovanie Island incident. Everything up to this point, every outbreak, every incident, every global crisis has followed the same basic playbook. A virus gets out, people mutate, soldiers show up, things explode. But in 2011, the Resident Evil timeline took a hard left into territory that feels less like bioterrorism and more like a Black Mirror episode, because what happened on Sin Island wasn't about infection. It was about copying a human soul. Dr. Alex Wesker, a former Umbrella virologist who vanished after the corporation crumbled, resurfaced on a remote island in the Baltic Sea with a research goal that makes every previous villain look quaint by comparison. She didn't want to build a weapon. She didn't want to sell a virus. She wanted to live forever. Specifically, she wanted to transfer her own consciousness into a younger, healthier body, effectively jumping from one host to another indefinitely, and escaping death entirely through biological body transplantation. And she had the technology to attempt it. Using classified Umbrella research she'd stolen before the company collapsed, Wesker developed a consciousness transfer system that used engineered viruses as encoding vehicles, essentially writing the patterns of a human mind into biological code and then imprinting that code onto a new host organism. 10 members of the TerraSave humanitarian organization were captured and used as experimental subjects alongside prisoners and security personnel. But Wesker's primary target was a 12-year-old girl named Natalia Korda, selected specifically because her psychological profile made her the ideal candidate for hosting a transplanted consciousness. Here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. The procedure worked, partially. Natalia survived the consciousness transfer, but her neurobiology was fundamentally rewritten in the process. She gained the ability to sense nearby mutant organisms through mechanisms that defy any conventional biological explanation. But that wasn't the real cost. The real cost was that Natalia's mind now contains two people. Her original self still exists, but so does a fragmented copy of Alex Wesker's personality, an alternate state Natalia calls Dark Natalia that surfaces unpredictably and operates with its own agenda. This wasn't a virus turning someone into a monster. This was a scientist copying herself into a child's brain. And it raises a question the Resident Evil universe had never confronted before. If someone's mind contains another person's duplicated consciousness, are they still the same person? Is Natalia still Natalia? Or is she slowly becoming Alex Wesker wearing a child's body? Nobody has a good answer. And that's exactly what makes Sign Island the most quietly terrifying incident in this entire timeline. No explosions, no citywide outbreaks, just a girl on an island whose mind isn't entirely her own anymore. But if consciousness transfer sounds like the strangest thing this franchise could throw at you, the very next year brought something far louder, far deadlier, and far more global in scale. 2012 to 2013, global C-virus bioterror attacks. The most dangerous bioterrorist in Resident Evil history isn't a cult leader, a mad scientist, or a rogue corporation. It's the United States National Security Advisor, Derek C. Simmons, held one of the most powerful intelligence positions in the American government, and he used it to run a shadow organization called the Family that had quietly embedded itself into the country's power structure for decades. But Simmons had a problem. President Adam Benford was preparing to publicly reveal the U.S. government's role in the Raccoon City cover-up, a disclosure that would have exposed the family and everything Simmons had built. So Simmons decided the president had to die, and he wasn't going to use a bullet. The weapon he chose was the C-virus, a pathogen so advanced it made every previous bioweapon look primitive. Dr. Carla Radames engineered it by combining a T. veronica derivative with G-virus material harvested from Sherry Birkin's blood. The result was a nightmare hybrid, infected organisms that were strong, fast, and unlike nearly every previous BOW in the franchise, genuinely intelligent. They could coordinate, they could think tactically, they could fight like soldiers. Simmons tested the C-virus during the Edonian Civil War in 2012, deploying it into active combat zones to evaluate its battlefield performance. But that was just the rehearsal. In June 2013, he unleashed the real operation on Tall Oaks. Specialized BOWs called Lapodicas dispersed the C-virus as an aerosol throughout the city, converting approximately 70,000 residents into infected undead within hours. The president was among the first casualties. Mission accomplished, but here's where Simmons' grand conspiracy ran headfirst into someone else's grand conspiracy. During the Tall Oaks attack, a mysterious organization calling itself Neo Umbrella claimed responsibility for simultaneous C-virus deployments across China and multiple Asian countries. Simmons had assumed he held a monopoly on C-virus weaponization. He didn't. An entirely separate terrorist network had independently acquired the same pathogen and was fielding it on a continental scale, completely outside his control. His carefully orchestrated shadow war had competition he never saw coming. The government's response was grimly familiar. On June 30th, 2013, 2 jets destroyed Tall Oaks with thermobaric warheads. That's the second time in this timeline that the American government obliterated one of its own cities with weapons of mass destruction to contain a bioweapon outbreak. An estimated 70,000 infected residents were killed, along with an unknown number of civilians who never got out. Meanwhile, Jake Muller, the son of Albert Wesker, was discovered carrying natural C-virus antibodies inherited through his father's modified genetics. He became the most wanted wanted person on the planet overnight. Simmons intercepted Jake specifically to prevent anyone from developing a vaccine, because a cure would undermine the family's leverage over the C virus entirely. Let that scope sink in for a second. The American National Security Advisor secretly ran biological weapons programs, murdered 70,000 people to assassinate a president, bombed a domestic city to cover the evidence, and still couldn't prevent a completely separate organization from deploying the exact same weapon independently. Every layer of institutional control failed simultaneously. The government wasn't just failing to stop bioterrorism, the government was bioterrorism. But if the C-virus crisis proved that institutions couldn't contain biological threats, the next chapter proved something even more unsettling. That the threats had evolved beyond anything institutions were even designed to fight. 2017 and 2021, the Winters family saga. After 11 eras of corporate greed, military black sites, government cover-ups, and weaponized parasites, the Resident Evil timeline ends with something nobody expected: a grieving mother. Mother Miranda lost her daughter Eva to the Spanish flu. That's it. That's her entire motivation. She wasn't chasing military contracts. She wasn't building a corporate empire. She was a biologist who wandered into a cave system in Eastern Europe, half mad with grief, and stumbled onto something ancient. The Megamycete, a hive-mind fungal organism unlike anything the franchise had ever introduced. Not a virus, not a parasite. A living fungal network capable of detecting when organisms it had infected died, capable of storing consciousness itself. Miranda spent decades experimenting with it, deriving the Kadu parasite from its biology and distributing it through the village she controlled. Most villagers mutated into wolf-like lichens, but 4 subjects responded differently, becoming her lords: Dimitrescu, Moreau, Beneviento, and Heisenberg. Once each granted unique superhuman abilities depending on how their biology interacted with the Kadu. All of it, every experiment, every monstrous transformation, every death in that village, existed for one reason. Miranda wanted her daughter back. But here's where it gets quietly terrifying. In 2017, a derelict tanker called E-001 introduced the world to Eveline, a bioweapon organism developed by classified American programs and lost at sea. Eveline wasn't a pathogen you deployed. She was sentient. She could spread infection through environmental contamination, she could make decisions, and she operated with independent will, a bioweapon that thinks for itself. That's not an escalation. That's an entirely new category of threat. Eveline infected Mia Winters before anyone understood what she was. And because Mia was infected during the conception of her daughter Rosemary, the infant was exposed to bioweapon biology before she was ever born. That made Rosemary extraordinarily valuable, not just to Miranda, who saw the child as a potential vessel for Eva's consciousness, but to every faction that learned she existed. In February 2021, Miranda abducted the infant. Ethan Winters, a civilian with 0 military training and 0 institutional backing, went after her. He fought through Miranda's village, through her infected subjects, through every one of her monstrous lords. And when every government agency, every military response team, every institutional mechanism had failed to stop the Megamycete, Ethan did it himself. He deliberately stayed behind to detonate an N2 explosive charge to destroy the organism at its source. He died saving his daughter. That's how the timeline ends. Not with a special forces operation, not with a thermobaric missile, with a father. And the part that should genuinely unsettle you is what survived. Rosemary Winters inherited superhuman characteristics from her pre-birth Megamycete exposure. The Shadows of Rose narrative confirms it. She didn't choose this. Nobody engineered it on purpose. No corporation signed off on it, no government authorized it. 50 years of Umbrella, of cover-ups, of weaponized viruses spreading across every continent on Earth, and the final result is a child who was born already changed. Bioweapon biology didn't just proliferate into black markets and terrorist cells. It proliferated into human genetics. Future generations may carry inherent viral modifications as standard biological inheritance. Not because someone designed it that way, but because after 5 decades of contamination, it became inevitable. That's the most unsettling conclusion the franchise could have written. Not a monster, not a conspiracy, just a baby who never had a choice. Resident Evil has had some bad games, but nothing prepared us for what Capcom did in 2016. They took a beloved franchise, gutted it, charged $30, and killed it less than 3 years later. Today we're ranking every Resident Evil game, starting with the one that made fans wonder if Capcom had lost their minds. Umbrella Corps, released in June 2016 for PS4 and PC, this was mostly a multiplayer shooter. It had a single-player mode called The Experiment with over 20 basic training missions, but no real campaign. The main focus was 3 versus 3 PvP matches, basically a bare-bones competitive shooter with almost none of the Resident Evil feel. Here's the kicker. It wasn't free to play. It cost $30 for a multiplayer game in a market where that was already risky. The Metacritic score sank to 43 over 100, a clear don't buy this signal. Players saw it as a cynical cash grab using the Resident Evil name without actually delivering a Resident Evil game. The game effectively died within 2.5 years. No farewell event, no final update. Umbrella Corps runs on P2P hosting, so Capcom never even had dedicated servers to formally shut down. It just quietly stopped mattering. Everyone who bought it had moved on, and no one new bothered. Umbrella Corps marked Resident Evil hitting rock bottom. Fans genuinely wondered if the series was done, but at least it didn't drag on like Operation Raccoon City, which stuck around to disappoint way longer. Operation Raccoon City is what happens when a major franchise outsources to a studio that has no idea what made the series work in the first place. Resident Evil. Operation Raccoon City, Slant 6 Games, not Capcom, developed this 2012 third-person shooter that dropped on PS3 and Xbox 360 with one job: make Resident Evil multiplayer. And here's the thing, they actually sold over 2 million copies in the first year, which is wild, because Metacritic gave it a 52. That's not a typo, 52. The game takes place during RE2 and RE3, but it's got nothing to do with either story. You're playing as Umbrella operatives, USS soldiers basically, running around Raccoon City with up to 3 friends in co-op. The AI teammates were there if you didn't have friends, which, you know, not ideal. The whole thing was designed around cooperative shooting, not survival horror. No resource scarcity, no tension, just 4 people blasting zombies and each other. Here's where it gets weird. Despite getting absolutely demolished by critics, it found an audience. 2 million people bought this thing. That tells you something about the fan base at the time. They wanted more Resident Evil, even if it was fundamentally broken, even if it didn't understand what made RE work. The community split hard on this one. Some people had genuine fun with the co-op chaos. Others saw it as proof that Capcom was willing to let anyone slap the RE logo on anything and call it a day. But if you think Operation Raccoon City was a departure, wait until you see what Capcom did next. Resident Evil 6 is Capcom's most ambitious disaster. Released October 2012 with 600 staff members and a budget that could have funded 3 smaller games, it sold 5.3 million copies and somehow still disappointed everyone. Resident Evil 6. Here's the thing about RE6. It wasn't bad because it was action focused. It was bad because it tried to be everything simultaneously. 4 separate campaigns, 20 hours of content, regenerating enemies that just wouldn't die, co-op modes, competitive modes, QuickTime events layered on top of QuickTime events. Capcom looked at their fanbase and decided the solution wasn't to pick a direction. It was to go in all of them at once. The game shipped with Leon's campaign being horror-tinged action, Chris's campaign being pure military shooter, Ada's campaign being stealth puzzle hybrid, and Jake's campaign being, honestly, nobody remembers Jake's campaign. Each one felt like a different game bolted onto the same engine, which sounds interesting until you realize it means none of them feel cohesive. It's like ordering a pizza and getting pizza, sushi, tacos, and a steak simultaneously. Sure, there's more food, but you didn't want more food. You wanted one good meal. Metacritic gave it 63 out of 100. That's not a score, that's a shrug. The community response was worse. RE6 became the franchise's turning point, the moment fans collectively agreed Capcom had lost the plot. It wasn't just that it abandoned horror, it's that it abandoned focus entirely. If you think RE6's identity crisis was bad, wait until you see what Capcom did next with multiplayer spin-offs that lasted shorter than a TikTok trend. Resident Evil Resistance / Reverse. Resident Evil tried multiplayer twice in recent years, and both times it went exactly nowhere. Resistance launched in April 2020 alongside the RE3 remake, which sounds generous until you realize it was asymmetrical 1 versus 4 gameplay where one player controlled a mastermind trying to stop 4 survivors. A Reverse came out in October 2022, bundled with Village, flipping the formula into competitive 4-player matches. Both sounded creative on paper. Both died within months. Here's the thing, peak concurrent players on PC never broke 5,000. For context, That's lower than most indie games that actually have communities. By 2024, Resistance was delisted entirely and pulled from digital stores. Reverse is still technically available, but sales end in March 2025, and servers shut down in June 2025. They're basically gone. The problem wasn't the ideas. Asymmetrical multiplayer can work. The problem was execution. And more importantly, nobody actually wanted to play them. Resistance had balance issues that made the mastermind either completely overpowered or completely useless depending on the map, as Reverse was a forgettable competitive shooter in a franchise built on single-player horror. Neither had the staying power to build a community, and without a community, multiplayer games are just expensive ghosts. Capcom learned something valuable from this. The franchise's strength isn't in competitive modes or live service experiments. It's in focused, story-driven campaigns. These weren't failures because the concepts were bad. They were failures because they didn't understand what people actually wanted from Resident Evil. But if you think multiplayer spin-offs were rough, wait until we get to the actual mainline games that people forgot about. Starting with a prequel that introduced one of the most frustrating inventory systems ever designed. Resident Evil 0 is the prequel nobody asked for that somehow made survival horror worse by overthinking it. Resident Evil 0, released in November 2002 as a GameCube exclusive. RE0 takes place just hours before the mansion incident, filling in gaps nobody needed filled. Sounds promising, it wasn't. The game introduced a dual character control system that let you swap between two protagonists on the fly, which sounds innovative until you realize it's just inventory management with extra steps. Here's the thing, instead of a traditional item box, you could drop items anywhere on the ground. Sounds flexible. In practice, you're constantly backtracking through hallways picking up stuff you dropped 3 rooms ago because you needed space for a key card. The game forces you to manage 2 inventories simultaneously, and it's tedious in ways the original games never were. The campaign runs about 4 to 5 hours, which is fine for a prequel. The problem is the story doesn't justify existing. You're watching Umbrella's plan unfold in real time, but it's less compelling than just reading about it in RE1. The mystery is gone. You already know how this ends. The dual character system gets praised by some players who genuinely enjoyed the puzzle-solving aspect, but most people found it more annoying than engaging. Critically, RE0 was competent. It wasn't broken. It just felt like Capcom experimenting with mechanics that didn't need experimenting. A 2016 remake brought it to modern platforms, but it didn't fix the fundamental design issues. The game exists in this weird space where it's technically sound, but fundamentally less interesting than the game surrounding it. But if you think RE0's mechanical confusion was bad, wait until you see what happens when the franchise tries to make a sequel that actually works. Resident Evil Revelations 2. Resident Evil Revelations 2 is the underdog story of the franchise's comeback era. Released in February 2015, it dropped on nearly every platform with an episodic structure that stretched across 4 weeks, unfolding a tight campaign lasting around 8 to 10 hours total and featuring 2 pairs of playable characters, Claire and Moira, plus Barry and Natalia. Now, this wasn't one of Capcom's big-budget extravaganzas. Far from it. Revelations 2 was made on a modest budget, yet it quickly gained a cult following, selling 2.6 million copies by March 2020 and becoming a fan favorite for good reason. The focus wasn't on bombastic set pieces or over-the-top action. It was on solid, suspenseful survival horror and character dynamics that felt personal. One of the biggest wins? The introduction of a robust raid mode with over 50 missions that offered some of the franchise's best cooperative gameplay outside the main story. Players could dive back in endlessly, sharpening combat skills and unlocking gear, which added a ton of replay value without flashy spectacle. Here's the kicker. Revelations 2 is widely credited with saving Resident Evil's focus on character-driven horror just before Resident Evil 7 flipped the series into a new direction. It proved that Capcom could still deliver genuinely tense, emotionally engaging stories without throwing mountains of money at it. The game's episodic format also allowed for tighter pacing, and its cliffhangers kept fans hooked week to week. It lacks the polish of AAA blockbusters, but makes up for it with atmosphere, suspense, and a story that actually matters to the characters we care about. So, Revelations 2 sits in this weird spot. Low budget, but high impact. A cult favorite that quietly brought Resident Evil back from the brink. And if you think that's an interesting twist, wait until we jump into the 2020 remake of Resident Evil 3, where things get a whole lot more controversial. Resident Evil 3 2020 remake dropped in April 2020, riding the massive momentum of RE2 Remake's success. Capcom had just proven they could take a classic and rebuild it for modern audiences, so everyone expected the same treatment for RE3 Remake. Turns out, no. Resident Evil 3 2020 remake. Here's the thing about the 2020 remake. It's not bad, it's just aggressively shorter. The original 1999 game offered a sprawling interconnected map where you'd backtrack through Raccoon City, solving puzzles and managing resources across multiple zones. The remake? 5 to 6 hours, linear sequences, then it's over. That's roughly 40% less content. And yeah, people noticed. The main draw is Nemesis. This monster hunts you relentlessly throughout the campaign, and the AI actually feels threatening. Unlike Mr. X in RE2 Remake, who was basically a scripted encounter you could learn to manipulate, Nemesis adapts. It's aggressive, unpredictable, parts and keeps you moving. That part works. The problem is, everything else got pared down to make room for it. Capcom scrapped the interconnected map entirely. Gone is exploring a living city with multiple routes and shortcuts. You're funneled through linear corridors with occasional branching paths looping back. Puzzle solving got gutted, and resource management became trivial, since the game's short length means you're never truly desperate for ammo or healing. Then there's Resistance, the multiplayer mode bundled with the remake. One player controls a mastermind setting traps and spawning enemies, while 4 survivors try to escape. It's not terrible, but it feels like filler. Something Capcom threw in to justify the $60 price tag when the single-player campaign can't carry it alone. The community split hard. Some liked the tighter pacing and Nemesis' constant threat. Others branded it a cash grab, a stripped-down classic riding RE2 Remake's goodwill without matching effort. Sales hit 2.8 million copies, but the debate never died down. If you think RE3 Remake's cuts were controversial, wait till you hear about Revelations. Resident Evil? Revelations. Resident Evil. Revelations is set on an abandoned luxury cruise ship called the Queen Zenobia, and you're exploring it with Jill Valentine trying to figure out what happened to the crew. The whole thing is structured episodically, which sounds gimmicky, but it actually works. Each episode ends on a cliffhanger, and you're constantly discovering new areas of the ship, solving puzzles, and piecing together the mystery. It's 8 to 10 hours of pure exploration and atmosphere, which is exactly what early Resident Evil games did best. Here's the thing. Revelations nailed the survival horror formula when the franchise was drowning in action. RE5 had already happened, and the series was bloated, overstuffed, and had completely lost the plot. Then this handheld game showed up and reminded everyone what made Resident Evil actually scary. Tight corridors, limited ammo, environmental puzzles, and genuine tension. The ship itself becomes a character. You're constantly backtracking, unlocking new areas, and the atmosphere is genuinely unsettling. The raid mode added over 100 separate stages across multiple areas and difficulties, which gave the game serious replay value. You could grind through these missions, unlock new weapons, and keep playing long after the campaign ended. For a handheld game, that's substantial content. When Revelations got ported to PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, it didn't just survive the transition, it thrived. Players who never touched a 3DS suddenly discovered this underrated gem, and the community response was immediate. Fans loved it, critics loved it, but somehow it still doesn't get mentioned in best of conversations nearly as much as it deserves. The reason Revelations matters is simple. It proved that you don't need cutting-edge hardware or massive budgets to make a great Resident Evil game. You need good design, atmosphere, and respect for what made the series work in the first place. It's the kind of game that gets overlooked because it came out on the wrong platform at the wrong time, but anyone who actually played it knows better, which makes RE5 look even worse by comparison, and because that game had every advantage and still managed to disappoint. Resident Evil 5 is the second best-selling mainline game in the franchise, yet it's also one of the most contentious. Released in 2009 for PS3 and Xbox 360, it sold 7.8 million copies and was built around co-op from the ground up. But here's where it gets complicated. Resident Evil 5. The game pairs Chris Redfield with Sheva Alomar, a local operative, and drops them into West Africa to stop a bioterrorism plot. 8 to 10 hours of solid action gameplay, tight gunplay, and the kind of spectacle Capcom had been building toward since RE4. On paper, it's a quality entry. The co-op works, the campaign is engaging, and mechanically it delivers exactly what RE5 promises. But the setting and enemy design sparked a conversation that hasn't stopped. You're fighting predominantly black enemies in an African setting, and the game doesn't exactly handle the optics with care. Infected villagers, tribal aesthetics, the whole package reads differently depending on who's playing. Some players see a game that was simply set in a location and populated it accordingly. Others see design choices that feel uncomfortable, even if unintentional. Here's the thing, both perspectives have merit. RE5 is genuinely a well-made action game. The mechanics are solid, the co-op is fun, and if you strip away the cultural context, it's mechanically sound. But context matters. The game exists in a real world where those design choices carry weight, and dismissing criticism as oversensitivity misses the legitimate point that representation in games does matter. The franchise has moved on, but RE5 remains a fascinating case study in how a commercially successful, mechanically competent game can still spark legitimate debate about its portrayal. It's not a bad game, it's just a complicated one. And speaking of complicated, Village takes everything RE5 did with co-op and atmosphere and pushes it in an entirely different direction. Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village had one of the toughest acts to follow. Coming off the franchise reviving RE7, it had to prove survival horror could still pack a punch in 2021's next-gen environment, and it mostly delivered. Clocking in around 10 to 12 hours, Village continues Ethan Winters' story, keeping the gritty first-person perspective that reinvented the series. But here's the thing. Even with next-gen releases on PS5 and Xbox Series X, the majority of its 5.4 million first-year sales came from PS4 and Xbox One. The player base had barely moved on, and Capcom wisely made sure to cater to both old-gen and new-gen hardware. Of course, Village isn't just known for gameplay. Lady Dimitrescu burst onto the scene so hard that she didn't just become a horror icon, but a downright meme sensation, dominating gaming culture far beyond the usual Resident Evil crowd. Big, imposing, and totally captivating, she single-handedly helped the game cross into mainstream hype in a way few RE characters ever have. Critically, Village scored a solid 84 on Metacritic, praised especially for its atmospheric environments and the way it blends gothic horror aesthetics with modern graphical power. That said, not everyone was wild about the story. Many players found it too convoluted, bouncing between horror, action set pieces, and weird lore dumps, which diluted the tension RE7 had so carefully built. Some argued the horror took a back seat to expanded action gameplay, making it feel more like an action horror hybrid than pure survival terror. Still, the effort to balance next-gen tech with mass appeal and ongoing storytelling ambition was clear. Resident Evil Village didn't just push graphical fidelity, it navigated meme culture, fan expectations, and a fractured player base all at once. It wasn't perfect, but it captured attention and kept the franchise relevant in a crowded market. If you think continuing Ethan Winters' saga in Village was an evolution, wait till you see where it all really began. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. Resident Evil 7 completely flipped the script on the entire franchise. After the bloated, over-the-top action disasters of Resident Evil 5 and 6, Capcom went all in on survival horror like it was 1996 again. And I can prove it with a tightly focused 9 to 11 hour campaign released in January 2017 that became an unexpected massive commercial success, selling over 13 million copies worldwide and earning a solid 86 on Metacritic. This wasn't just a slight course correction, it was a total reinvention that shocked fans and critics alike. The most obvious and game-changing difference was perspective. Resident Evil 7 ditched the classic third-person camera for a first-person view, throwing players headfirst into the grime, darkness, and constant dread of the Baker family estate. This immersion cranked the horror dial to 11. Every creak, scrape, and shadow felt intensely personal and claustrophobic. You didn't just watch horror happen, you experienced it from a terrifyingly close angle. It was like the difference between reading a scary story and living it, but that first-person shift was only the start. The game's pacing also slowed down drastically compared to its predecessors. Instead of mindless action every 5 minutes, RE7 made you actually explore environments, manage scarce ammo and health supplies, and really fear what might be lurking just around the corner. This return to classic survival horror mechanics brought back the tension and careful pacing that had long been missing. The complexity, atmosphere, and world building restored faith in the franchise exactly when that faith was at its lowest point. DLC episodes like Not a Hero and End of Zoe added substantial hours of story content, expanding the tangled web of secrets behind the viral outbreak. These extras weren't just side quests. They deepened the narrative and hooked you long after finishing the main campaign. It's widely agreed RE7 saved Resident Evil from the brink of permanent decline. After RE6, most thought the series was dead in the water. RE7 showed Capcom wasn't just listening to fans. They were learning, evolving, and committed to rebuilding their flagship horror legacy. Sure, some longtime fans missed the explosive bombast of past entries, but the critical acclaim for RE7 was near universal. It stands as a landmark entry that redefined what a Resident Evil game could be, proving survival horror still had frightening bite left in 2017 and beyond. In this way, it paved the way for everything that followed, including the ambitious RE Village. But if you think that radical first-person overhaul was bold, wait until you hear about the wild leap Resident Evil. Code Veronica took nearly a decade earlier. Resident Evil, Code Veronica. Resident Evil. Code Veronica is like the forgotten middle child of the franchise, not as hyped as RE4, but absolutely crucial in the series' evolution. Released in 2000 exclusively for the Sega Dreamcast, it was the last mainline Resident Evil to grace that dying platform before eventually porting to PlayStation 2, GameCube, and later systems. For about a year and a half, this was the Dreamcast's crown jewel, a defining title trying to keep the console relevant in the face of looming obsolescence. The game features an 8 to 10 hour campaign starring both Claire and Chris Redfield, who you might remember as staples of the franchise by that point. Those dual perspectives allowed Code Veronica to expand on the Resident Evil story beyond what RE2 and RE3 had done, plunging deeper into Umbrella's secrets and the Redfield family drama. But here's the kicker. Fans have long debated whether Code Veronica is actually the true sequel to RE2 or if that title belongs to RE3. Officially, it came after RE3's release, but its narrative ambitions arguably make it feel more like the direct continuation. Code Veronica occupies a strange space in the timeline and in player memory. It keeps the classic survival horror feel alive with fixed camera angles and puzzle solving, but hints at the bigger changes coming with RE4's overhaul of gameplay and storytelling. It's the bridge between old and new, mixing familiar scares with more cinematic storytelling and slightly revamped mechanics. Despite none of those things, Code Veronica is often overshadowed by the revolutionary impact of RE4. RE4 practically reinvented the franchise overnight, and so this game gets labeled underrated or hidden gem among hardcore fans who prize its deepening plot and solid atmosphere. But play it and you'll find it holds up pretty well, with tense moments, memorable villains, and some genuinely creepy set pieces. The Dreamcast exclusivity meant it never quite reached the huge audience it deserved at launch, but the later ports cemented its place in Resident Evil history. It's that transitional classic that hardcore fans swear by, even if casual players jump straight from RE3 to RE4. But if you think that's a niche title, wait until you see what the original Resident Evil brought to the table and how it started this whole survival horror obsession. Resident Evil. Resident Evil's original release in March 1996 wasn't just another game on the PlayStation. It was the birth of survival horror as we know it. Clocking in at around 5 to 7 hours, this compact campaign laid down the blueprint for an entire genre, introducing gameplay and storytelling elements that remain iconic decades later. Everything that came after owes something to what Capcom built here. Before you roll your eyes at tank controls and fixed camera angles, hear me out. These dated mechanics actually define the feel of the game. The clunky movement and restrictive viewpoints weren't just technical limits, they forced tension and cautious play, making every corner and enemy encounter a nail-biter. Players were put right in the oppressive shoes of Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, with environments dripping in atmosphere and dread. You couldn't just sprint through hallways, you had to think, plan, and move deliberately. Resident Evil sold about 5 million copies over its lifetime, snagging an impressive 89 out of 100 on Metacritic. That score isn't just nostalgia's doing. Critics and fans alike recognize it as a masterpiece. The game introduced key franchise staples, item management that could make or break your run, creative puzzle solving, and the unforgettable sense that you were barely surviving in a nightmare world. The narrative tropes it established, the shadowy Umbrella Corporation, biological horrors, and isolated mansions, became the spine of the series. Every survival horror game that followed borrowed from this playbook. Here's where it gets weird. What started as a technical workaround, like tank controls originally meant to cope with clunky 3D engines, ended up becoming a genre hallmark. Some argue that these controls are part of why the game still scares us, because they limit player agency just enough to keep vulnerability front and center. It's a design born from necessity, but elevated by intention. The developers didn't set out to create psychological tension through mechanical restriction, but that's exactly what happened. Capcom didn't just make a game, they crafted an experience that has stood the test of time. Because while modern entries have smoothed out the rough edges and modernized the controls, none have captured that original blend of survival tension, environmental storytelling, and chilling mood quite like Resident Evil did in 1996. It's both the franchise's foundation and its crown jewel, universally recognized as a classic masterpiece that defined what horror games could be. But if you think the original's legacy is impressive, wait until we dive into Resident Evil 2, which took everything this game started and turned it into something absolutely legendary. Resident Evil 2? Resident Evil 2 is the masterpiece that proved the franchise could expand without losing its soul. Released in January 1998 on PlayStation, it landed on basically every platform that existed after that, from Dreamcast to GameCube to N64. The campaign runs 5 to 8 hours, depending on how thorough you are. But here's where it gets clever. The A/B scenario system means you're not just replaying the same game twice. Leon and Claire's campaigns are genuinely different, with different puzzles, different enemy placements, different story beats. You're looking at roughly 10 to 12 hours of distinct content if you actually commit to both playthroughs. That's not padding, that's design. The numbers back this up. Metacritic 89 out of 100. 5 million copies sold. Those aren't just good numbers, they're the numbers that defined what a survival horror game could be before RE4 came along and redefined the entire industry. But the real achievement isn't the sales or the critical score, it's that RE2 introduced Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, and they immediately became iconic. Not because of cutscenes or character development, but because you spent 5 to 8 hours with them in the most atmospheric, claustrophobic version of Raccoon City the series has ever created. The atmosphere is suffocating. The map design forces you into tight corridors and interconnected rooms where you're constantly aware of what's behind you and what's ahead. Ammo is scarce enough that you're making real decisions about whether to fight or run. Puzzles actually require you to think instead of just following waypoints. The game respects your intelligence and your time. It doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't explain everything. It just drops you into a nightmare and trusts you to figure it out. Here's the thing. RE2 is almost universally beloved. Fans still replay it 25 years later. The only real criticism you'll hear is nostalgia-driven complaints about tank controls, and even that's more of a yeah. They're dated acknowledgement than actual hatred. Nobody seriously argues RE2 is bad. The conversation isn't whether it's good. The conversation is whether it's the best pre-RE4 game or whether it's the best game in the entire franchise. That's the level of reverence we're talking about here. It set the standard for replayability that the series has chased ever since. The A/B scenario system meant you weren't just grinding through the same content twice, you were experiencing a genuinely different game, different routes, different encounters, different story implications. That's not a gimmick. That's respect for the player's time. But if you think, oh, RE2 is the peak of what Capcom could do with this formula, says wait until you see what they did when they rebuilt it from scratch 21 years later. Resident Evil 2, 2019 remake. Resident Evil 2 didn't just get a remake, it got a resurrection. When Capcom announced they were rebuilding RE2 from the ground up in 2018, nobody knew if they could pull it off. The original was perfect, untouchable. Remaking perfection is how you destroy a legacy. But then January 2019 happened, and suddenly everyone had to eat their words. They took the 1998 masterpiece and rebuilt it entirely using the Ahashar-E engine. New camera, new controls, new everything. Gone were the tank controls and fixed camera angles that defined the original. In their place, an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective that felt modern without feeling wrong. The game still felt like RE2. It just felt like RE2 in 2019. The campaign ran 7 to 10 hours depending on how you played it. They kept the dual scenario system intact, meaning Leon and Claire's playthroughs were genuinely different experiences. Different puzzles, different encounters, different story beats. You weren't just replaying the same game twice with a different character model. You were playing two distinct campaigns that happened to share the same location. Here's where it gets wild. The remake hit 91 on Metacritic. That's not a typo. That's higher than the original's 89. 3 million copies sold in the first year alone. didn't just succeed, it proved that you could modernize a classic without gutting what made it special. The praise was almost universal. Critics loved it, fans loved it. Even the hardcore purists who swore the original was untouchable had to admit the remake was exceptional. Mr. X, the relentless pursuer stalking you through the police station, became even more terrifying with modern graphics and that over-the-shoulder perspective. You could actually see him coming. That somehow made it worse. The only real debate that emerged was which version was better. And that's not really a debate. That's just people having different preferences. Some players prefer the original's puzzle design and atmosphere, others prefer the remake's presentation and controls. Both arguments hold water. Both versions are phenomenal. The fact that fans can't decisively pick a winner isn't a flaw. It's proof that Capcom nailed the balance between respect and reinvention. This is what a remake should be, not a cash grab. Not a cynical repackaging, a genuine translation of a masterpiece into a new era while keeping its soul intact. RE2 Remake didn't just update a classic, it proved the classic was timeless enough to survive the update. But if you think one remake was impressive, wait until you see what Capcom did with RE4, Resident Evil 4, 2005/2023 remake. There's no way to talk about this game without sounding like you're exaggerating. A 96 on Metacritic, 7.8 million copies sold, a 12 to 15 hour campaign that somehow never dips in quality from the opening village siege to the final boss. Resident Evil 4 didn't just save the franchise, it rewrote the rules for every third-person shooter that came after it. Before RE4, aiming in a third-person game meant locking onto enemies and hoping for the best. Capcom looked at that system, threw it in the garbage, and invented the over-the-shoulder camera. You know, the thing that literally every action game has used for the last 2 decades. Gears of War? Think RE4. The Last of Us? Think RE4. Dead Space? You get the idea. One design decision in 2005 became the foundation of an entire genre, and nobody's improved on the core concept since. But here's the thing that makes RE4 special, beyond its mechanical innovation. The pacing is immaculate. You start in a village fighting farmers with pitchforks. By the midpoint, you're dodging laser grids in a castle. By the end, you're on a military island, fighting regenerating monstrosities that can only be killed by shooting parasites inside their bodies with an infrared scope. Every chapter escalates. Every new area introduces mechanics you haven't seen before. There's zero filler in a 15-hour game, which is basically a miracle of game design. Leon Kennedy went from a rookie cop in Raccoon City to the most absurdly competent special agent in gaming history, suplexing cultists and delivering one-liners like he's getting paid per quip. The Merchant alone became one of the most iconic NPCs ever created. What are you buying? Lives rent-free in the heads of millions of people who played this game as teenagers, which is, you know, not a bad legacy for a guy who just stands in corners selling guns. Then in 2023, Capcom did something borderline insane. They remade it. They looked at a game with a 96 Metacritic score and said, yeah, we can do that again. And honestly, they mostly pulled it off. The remake launched on PS5, Xbox Series X, and PC to a 93 on Metacritic, and moved 1.3 million copies in its first month alone. It's a gorgeous and mechanically tight reimagining that modernizes the combat and expands the narrative. But here's where it gets complicated. The remake is excellent by every objective measure. Gorgeous visuals, refined controls, expanded story beats, and yet some fans still prefer the original. Not because the remake is worse, but because the 2005 version had this specific elegance to it, a simplicity in its design that felt almost effortless. The remake adds complexity where the original had clarity, and depending on who you ask, that's either an upgrade or a side grade. Both versions are masterpieces. That's not hyperbole. That's just the reality of a game so influential that 18 years after release, the industry is still building on its foundation. RE4 is the ceiling. It's the game every entry in this franchise gets measured against, and the game most third-person shooters get measured against whether they know it or not. And with the franchise sitting at its absolute peak, there's only one thing left to talk about. What comes next? Resident Evil Requiem. And then there's the one we can't actually rank yet. Resident Evil Requiem is scheduled for 2026 across PS5, Xbox Series X/S, and PC, and Capcom is calling it the grand finale to the modern RE narrative arc, the one that started with RE7's Louisiana Nightmare and continued through Village's Gothic Insanity. This is supposed to be the ending. Here's what we know. Ethan Winters is back, which raises some immediate questions if you finished Village. Returning characters from across the franchise are confirmed, and beyond that, Capcom has told us almost nothing, on purpose. That's That's basically the entire fact sheet. It's coming, Ethan's involved, other people are involved, please look forward to it, which is, not a lot to work with. But the silence is kind of the point. Capcom knows exactly what they're sitting on. RE7 revitalized the entire franchise from the brink of irrelevance. Village turned a tall vampire lady into the most memed character in gaming history and sold over 5 million copies in its first year. The modern trilogy has earned a level of goodwill that Capcom hasn't had since the original RE4 era, and now they have to stick the landing. The pressure here is genuinely enormous. Ending a trilogy is one of the hardest things any storytelling medium can attempt. For every Return of the King, there are 15 Game of Thrones, Season 8s. Fans have spent years building theories about the Megamycete, about BSAA's corruption, about what Ethan actually is now, about whether Chris Redfield is finally going to get a storyline that doesn't end with him punching a boulder. The expectations aren't just high, they're unreasonable, and Capcom has to meet them anyway. The speculation is running wild. Some fans think Requiem will tie all the way back to the original Umbrella Corporation storyline. Others think it's going to go full cosmic horror with the Megamycete's origins. A few people are convinced every protagonist from every game is showing up for one massive final act. Nobody actually knows. That's the beauty and the terror of it. What I can tell you is this. If Capcom delivers even half of what the community is hoping for, Requiem could be the definitive Resident Evil experience. The culmination of nearly 30 years of survival horror, bioweapons, questionable corporate decisions, and characters who refuse to stay dead, and if they don't deliver, well, at least we'll always have RE4. Resident Evil has one of the most convoluted storylines in gaming history, spanning decades of corporate conspiracy, viral evolution, and enough bioweapons to make a CDC employee cry. But here's the thing, it actually makes sense. All of it. Every zombie, every mutant, every shadowy corporation traces back to a single flower in West Africa. So today, I'm breaking down the entire Resident Evil story from beginning to end, starting with the moment everything went wrong, the discovery of the progenitor virus. In 1966, three men pooled their money to fund an expedition to West Africa. Oswell Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus wanted a flower, specifically the Stairway to the Sun, a ceremonial plant used by an isolated tribe for generations. What they extracted from it was the progenitor virus, an organism capable of rewriting host DNA at cellular level. There was just one small problem. It killed almost everyone it touched, near universal lethality. You couldn't aim it, couldn't control it, couldn't do anything useful with it in its raw form, which is, not ideal when your whole plan revolves around weaponizing it, but Spencer didn't care. By 1968, he co-founded Umbrella Pharmaceutical Company, legitimate drug company on paper, covert bioweapons program underneath, driven by eugenics and population control. Your standard Tuesday for a billionaire with a god complex. Progenitor's instability meant Umbrella's scientists had to develop derivative strains, the T-virus, the G-virus, Ouroboros, each one an attempt to tame what couldn't be tamed, and each one multiplied the threat instead of containing it. Every single disaster in this franchise exists because these people couldn't leave a flower alone. And Resident Evil Village later reveals Spencer wasn't even original. Mother Miranda had already been experimenting with the mold decades before he showed up. He basically copied her homework and added corporate funding. But if a virus and some shady paperwork sound relatively tame, wait until you see what happened when Umbrella's containment inevitably failed. The Mansion incident, STARS Alpha Team was the best of the best. Elite operatives, hardened professionals, the kind of people you send when things go sideways, which is exactly why they were chosen to die. Here's the thing. In July 1998, Bravo Team goes dark, investigating bizarre murders in the Arklay Mountain. Alpha Team gets deployed to find them. Standard rescue op, except it's not a rescue op at all. Their commanding officer, Albert Wesker, is an Umbrella double agent, and he has deliberately funneled his own elite unit into a mansion full of monsters because he needs combat data. He needs to know how bioorganic weapons perform against trained humans. His squad isn't a rescue team. They're lab rats with guns. The Spencer Mansion is ground zero for the T-virus, a stabilized derivative of progenitor designed to be more scalable and controllable than the raw strain. In theory, more predictable. In practice, the place is crawling with zombies, mutant dogs, hunters, and a tyrant that could rip a person in half without really trying. So much for controllable. But here's where it gets complicated. Wesker doesn't just betray his team. He fakes his own death, injects himself with a virus virus that grants superhuman abilities, and walks away. The man turns himself into the franchise's big bad for the next decade. Meanwhile, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine survive the mansion, blow it sky high, and spend the rest of their careers trying to make sure nobody else has to fight through something like that again. They eventually help found the BSAA, dedicated entirely to stopping bioterror. The mansion is where theory becomes catastrophe, where a pharmaceutical company's secret research meets actual human suffering for the first time. And the survivors? They never stop fighting, but at least the mansion was one building in the middle of nowhere. What happens next makes it look like a house fire compared to a nuclear meltdown. The destruction of Raccoon City. A mansion in the mountains is one thing. An entire American city is something else entirely. September 1998. Contaminated rats spread the T-virus through Raccoon City's sewers and water supply after a leak at Umbrella's underground nest facility. Within days, over 100,000 people are either dead or shambling through the streets looking for something warm to chew on. The Raccoon Police Department collapses. Infrastructure fails. And into this nightmare walk 3 people who have no business surviving it. Leon Kennedy shows up for his first day as a cop. Claire Redfield rolls into town looking for her brother. Jill Valentine, fresh off the mansion incident, tries to escape while a 7-foot bioweapon called Nemesis chases her through every alley in the city, which is, not ideal. But here's where it gets properly ugly. William Birkin, the man who created the G-Virus, gets gunned down by Umbrella's own retrieval squad when he refuses to hand over his research. So he injects himself with his own creation and mutates into something that barely qualifies as biology anymore. The company literally eating its own people. Meanwhile, Ada Wong slips through the chaos like she's grocery shopping, secures viral samples for unnamed buyers, and vanishes. Cool. Add that to the list. The US government's solution? A missile strike. They flatten the entire city. Over 100,000 civilians gone. And the truly uncomfortable part is that it works. Officially, this is framed as decisive containment. Unofficially, an American city just got sacrificed on the altar of plausible deniability. Every survivor scatters. Leon gets absorbed into government work. Claire disappears into humanitarian efforts. Sherry Birkin, exposed to the G-Virus, develops a unique physiology that multiple factions will spend the next decade trying to exploit. The seeds of a global bioweapons black market are planted right here, in the ashes of a city nobody could save, but at least Raccoon City's destruction finally put Umbrella under a spotlight. And what happened next? Well, let's just say corporate accountability moved at its usual glacial pace. The fall of Umbrella. Here's the thing nobody warns you about when it comes to Umbrella's death. It's boring. The most dangerous pharmaceutical company in human history, responsible for the destruction of an entire American city, the creation of dozens of bioweapons, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, dies in a courtroom. Not a boss. Not a dramatic showdown with Chris Redfield punching a boulder through its corporate headquarters. A class action lawsuit. Exposed by litigation, bankrupted by financial penalties, and formally dissolved around 2003 after landmark trial, finds them liable for Raccoon City. Cool. Justice served. Roll credits. Except no. Because here's where it gets complicated. You can kill a corporation, but you cannot kill a virus that's already been sold, copied, and distributed across 3 continents. Umbrella's research data, its viral samples, its key personnel, all of it scatters like roaches when you flip the kitchen light on. Former scientists take jobs at new firms. Hard drives full of T-virus data end up on black market auction blocks. And one Albert Wesker, very much alive and enhanced after his little death at the mansion, starts operating as a freelance broker, raiding former Umbrella facilities, collecting samples, selling them to whoever's buying. The buyers are plentiful. Tricell, a multinational conglomerate, rises almost immediately to fill the power vacuum, quietly absorbing Umbrella's leftover infrastructure and research. Cut off one corporate head, 3 more grow back. Meanwhile, on the hero side, the BSAA gets formally established as a multinational counter-bioterror force. Chris, Jill, other former STARS members join up, which sounds great until you realize they're now fighting a Hydra instead of a single dragon. And years later, Blue Umbrella emerges, a reformed version of the company. Supposedly good now. Nobody trusts them. Nobody should. The uncomfortable truth of this entire era is that legal justice cannot contain dispersed bioweapons. You can bankrupt the company that made the bomb, but the bomb is already in 50 different hands across the globe, which brings us to the first major proof of that problem, the Las Plagas bioterror threat. Here's where Resident Evil does something genuinely clever. After 3 games of shambling, rotting, brain-dead zombies, the franchise introduces a threat that can think, and that changes everything. In 2004, Leon Kennedy gets sent to a remote Spanish village to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley Graham. Simple enough. except the village isn't abandoned or overrun. It looks completely normal. People are working, talking, going about their day, and then they try to kill you with axes and pitchforks in perfect coordination. The Los Illuminados cult, led by Osman Sadler, has dug up Las Plagas, ancient parasite that was sealed underground centuries earlier by a noble family who knew exactly how dangerous it was. Sadler weaponizes it, implanting parasites into the local population to create ganados. These aren't zombies. They retain full cognitive function. They can use weapons, set traps, communicate, and follow complex tactical orders. They're obedient soldiers wearing the skin of ordinary villagers. That's the real horror here. A T-virus outbreak announces itself. You see the bodies, the decay, the chaos. A Plagas-infected village looks like a village, until it doesn't. Sadler's plan is genuinely insidious. Infect Ashley, send her home to Daddy, and let the parasite quietly compromise global leadership from the inside out. No missiles, no outbreaks, just obedience spreading through handshakes and hugs at state dinner, which is, not ideal. But here's the kicker. Las Plagas has zero connection to Progenitor, zero connection to Umbrella. This is a completely independent ancient biothreat that humanity sealed away once, forgot about, and then immediately weaponized the second someone cracked the seal again. Problem isn't one evil corporation. Problem is us. We find these things and we cannot help ourselves. And of course, Ada Wong is there, stealing Plagas samples for unnamed buyers, because that's what happens now. Every new biothreat gets harvested, packaged, and sold before the bodies are even cold. Those samples end up feeding directly into Tricell's research for Resident Evil 5, proving that the bioweapons pipeline doesn't need Umbrella to function. It's self-sustaining. But if the Plagas represent the next evolution of bioterror, then what Tricell does with that research in Africa is the next evolution of corporate evil, the execution of Tricell and Kijuju. Every single thread in this franchise converges here. Progenitor, Plagas, Umbrella's ideology, all of it funnels into one guy's delusional plan to play God. And that guy is Albert Wesker. By 2009, Chris Redfield and his partner Sheva Alomar deployed to Kijuju, Africa, on behalf of the BSAA. What they find is Tricell, a pharmaceutical corporation that has quietly become Umbrella 2.0. They've acquired progenitor samples, raided Umbrella's old facility data, and gotten their hands on Type 2 Plagas to create a controllable army of infected locals, which is, not ideal, but here's where it gets genuinely unhinged. Wesker and Tricell executive Excella Gione have been cooking up something called Ouroboros. It's a progenitor-derived virus designed to selectively evolve genetically compatible humans into superior beings while killing literally everyone else. A forced global extinction event disguised as evolution. Spencer dreamed about this. Wesker decided to actually do it. Here's the thing though, Ouroboros doesn't work. Not really. It almost universally kills or grotesquely mutates hosts into writhing biomass nightmares rather than perfecting them. The chosen few that Wesker believes will emerge? Basically nobody qualifies. And Excella, the woman who bankrolled and facilitated the entire project, gets consumed by her own virus, eaten alive by the thing she helped create. Corporate greed devouring its own architect. You can't write a more on-the-nose metaphor. Wesker, naturally convinced he's the one exception to Ouroboros' kill rate, merges with the virus for the final confrontation. Chris and Shiva fight him inside an active volcanic crater, because at this point the series has fully committed to being the most insane action movie ever made. They pump him full of rockets, he falls into lava. A character arc spanning the entire franchise, closed. Tricell's African division collapses, but the uncomfortable question lingers. How much progenitor and Ouroboros research survived in their other branches? Because in this universe, killing the company never kills the science, and that science is about to resurface in ways nobody expected. The Neo Umbrella global attacks. By 2012, bioterror wasn't just a shadowy threat lurking in secret labs. It had become fully globalized, corporate, and disturbingly sophisticated. Neo Umbrella, the successor to the infamous corporation, launched coordinated assaults hitting tall oaks in the US, Lanshan in China, and Edonia in Eastern Europe. The weapon, the C-Virus, a freakishly versatile agent that can turn its victims into shambling zombies, cunning Javo mutants, or massive chrysalid monsters depending on how much you dose them. Here's the kicker. Neo Umbrella's leader, Carla Radames, is herself a tragic product of this biotechnological nightmare. Scientists forcibly transformed her into a clone of Ada Wong, one of the series' most mysterious figures. So the person pulling the strings on these attacks is both a perpetrator and victim of the very virus she unleashes, her own identity rewritten and weaponized. Behind Carla's Neo Umbrella, a secret cabal known as the Family quietly manipulates global events. Led by powerful figures like Derek Simmons, this shadowy group blurs the line between brutal terrorism and state-sponsored bioengineering engineering warfare. This isn't just rampaging monsters or rogue scientists anymore. It's geopolitical chess with viruses as the pieces. The human cost is deeply personal too. Jake Muller, a mercenary caught in the chaos, turns out to be the biological son of Albert Wesker, Umbrella's original madman. Jake's blood is unique. It can neutralize the C virus, making him a literal living antidote amid the chaos. This ties the present outbreaks directly back to Umbrella's dark path, proving you can't escape your biological inheritance in this world. These attacks mark the peak of Bioterror's corporate evolution, fully branded, multinational, and tangled with political agendas. The Umbrella name, long thought dead, is wielded as a terrifying symbol of psychological warfare, sowing fear as much as infection. And Carla embodies the tragedy of humanity, caught up in biotech forces bigger than themselves, a villain rewritten by the very science she exploits. But if you think that's complex, just wait until we dive into the eerie mold outbreak that followed. The Dulve mold outbreak. After years of globe-trotting action sequences and international bioterror conspiracies, the franchise does something nobody expected. It puts you in a house, one family, and somehow it's the scariest thing the series has done in a decade. In 2017, Ethan Winters receives a message from his wife Mia, who vanished 3 years earlier. He drives to Dulve, Louisiana, walks into the Baker family estate, and immediately discovers that everything about this rescue mission is wrong. Mia wasn't kidnapped. She was working as a covert bioweapons courier for a criminal network called The Connections, transporting a weapon that looks like a 10-year-old girl. Her name is Eveline, and she is genuinely one of the most unsettling concepts this franchise has ever produced. She's a genetically engineered child designed to infiltrate populations by weaponizing the single most universal human need, family. She doesn't want to kill you. She wants you to love her, and if the mold she carries gets into your system, so you will. You won't have a choice. The Baker family are the proof. Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, Zoe. They were normal people before a tanker accident dumped Eveline into their bayou. Now they're regenerating, violent, and psychologically fused into a grotesque parody of domestic life, hosting dinner parties with human remains and calling it hospitality. But here's what makes it genuinely tragic. Their real personalities still break through. Jack Baker, in one of the game's most devastating moments, apologizes to Ethan. He knows what he's become. He just can't stop it. The mold itself represents something fundamentally new. Every previous threat in this franchise corrupted the body. Viruses rotted flesh, parasites hijacked motor function. The mold rewrites identity. It regenerates tissue, blurs the boundary between living and dead, and connects infected hosts into a psychic network controlled by whoever sits at the top. It's not just infection anymore, it's assimilation. And then Chris Redfield shows up in the finale working for something called Blue Umbrella, which is exactly as suspicious as it sounds. The old Umbrella legacy isn't dead. It just got a rebrand and a consulting contract. But if the Dulve outbreak seems contained, almost quaint in its scale, that's only because nobody has looked underground yet. The Megamycete and the Winters legacy. Every single disaster in this franchise, every zombie, every outbreak, every mutant abomination traces back to one grieving mother. Mother Miranda lost her daughter Ava to the Spanish flu over a century ago. Instead of processing that grief like a normal person, she discovered a vast underground fungal superorganism called the Megamycete and decided death was optional, which is not ideal for the rest of humanity. Here's the thing about the Megamycete. It doesn't just infect your cells. It stores you. Your memories, your consciousness, your entire experiential existence gets absorbed into this biological hard drive buried under Eastern Europe. It's not a virus. It's not a parasite. It's a backup server made of fungus. Miranda spent decades experimenting on villagers, trying to find the perfect vessel to download her dead daughter's consciousness into. She created the Four Lords. She built a cult. She turned an entire region into her personal laboratory. But here's the kicker. A young Oswell E. Spencer visited Miranda, studied her work, and took ideas about reshaping humanity back home with him. He founded Umbrella. Every single thing that went wrong in this franchise happened because Spencer was Miranda's student. Around 2021, Miranda kidnaps Rose Winters, intending to use her mold-saturated body as a vessel to finally bring Eva back. Ethan fights through the village to save her, and then comes the gut punch. Ethan Winters has been dead since Dulve. The mold killed him during Resident Evil 7 and simply kept his consciousness running. He was never alive for any of it. Not the Baker house, not fatherhood, none of it. A dead man walking on borrowed fungus. And knowing that, he sacrifices what's left of himself to destroy the Megamycete's core. A man already dead, choosing to die again, so his daughter doesn't have to. Rose emerges years later as a teenager with extraordinary abilities. She's the culmination of everything. Progenitor, the mold, Umbrella's legacy, Miranda's obsession, multi-generational bioengineering condensed into one girl who didn't ask for any of it. The franchise started with a pharmaceutical company making zombies in a basement. It ends with a question that has no clean answer. When consciousness can be stored and reconstructed, when a person can be built from inherited biological trauma they never chose, what does it actually mean to be human anymore? I don't know what to tell you, but that's the story of Resident Evil. Resident Evil is a franchise about survival, but the survival horror has always been downstream of something worse: human ambition. Every zombie, every BOW, every city that burned, and every population that was used as an experiment points back to a person. Someone with a title, a lab coat, a cult following, or a pharmaceutical corporation who decided that other people were acceptable costs on the way to something greater. The villains of Resident Evil are not monsters in the traditional sense. They are doctors, executives, soldiers, and scientists who chose their work over their conscience so many times that the distinction eventually stopped mattering. The 9 below are the architects of the franchise's global bioterror timeline, ordered from the first to lay the philosophical groundwork, to the last to weaponize what they left behind. This is the story of how one pharmaceutical conspiracy became a species-level extinction event: Mother Miranda. Everything in Resident Evil's lore is downstream of something. The G-Virus is downstream of the progenitor virus. The progenitor virus is downstream of Spencer's ambition and Spencer's ambition. The central engine of the entire franchise's mythology is downstream of a woman named Miranda, who lived in a remote European village and discovered something incomprehensible underneath it before Oswell Spencer was born. In the early 1920s, Miranda's young daughter Eva died during the Spanish flu pandemic. Miranda, a scientist and a believer in the possibility of impossible things, did not accept this. She found the Megamycete, a vast fungal network growing beneath her village, ancient and interconnected, capable of preserving the consciousness of the dead within its biological memory. She spent decades studying it, experimenting on villagers, shaping the local religion around her own research, presenting herself as a divine figure, the Black God, whose blessing came in the form of parasitic infections that made the recipients obedient and monstrous. She didn't build a laboratory. She built a theology, a complete religious and social structure that turned an entire village into her research population, where every transformation could be observed, documented, and refined over the course of years without outside interference. She created the Four Lords, Karl Heisenberg, Alcina Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, and Salvatore Moreau, by infecting them with Cadu, a parasite derived from the Megamycete, producing 4 transformed subjects who became the pillars of her controlled territory and the guardians of the 4 flasks containing her experimental materials. The key players in Miranda's eventual destruction were, in 2021, Ethan Winters and Chris Redfield, neither of whom came to her village as heroes of a grand conspiracy, but as desperate, grief-driven individuals who happened to arrive in the same nightmare at the same time. Ethan came for his daughter. Chris came for Mia. Miranda came for Eva, using Rose Winters as a vessel for the resurrection she had been planning for a century. The lore connectivity of Mother Miranda is the single most significant revelation in the modern franchise era. Oswell E. Spencer himself visited Miranda's village as a young man and witnessed the Megamycete's properties. Her research into biological preservation and controlled infection directly inspired his subsequent founding of Umbrella Corporation and his decades-long pursuit of the progenitor virus. Miranda didn't create Umbrella. She created the conditions that made Umbrella's philosophy feel possible, that biological mortality was a problem to be engineered around, that the individual body was a system to be overwritten rather than a limit to be accepted. Every T-virus zombie, every G mutation, every Ouroboros experiment, every Las Plagas infection, the philosophical lineage traces to a grief-stricken mother in a European village who refused to accept death and built an institution around that refusal. The Resident Evil franchise's entire mythology, across 30 years of games and dozens of viral strains and countless destroyed cities, is the extended consequence of one woman deciding that the death of someone she loved was not a fact she was willing to live with. She was killed by Ethan Winters, who understood exactly what she was trying to do because he had been trying to do the same thing from the moment he stepped off a plane to Louisiana looking for his missing wife. The difference was that Ethan, when the moment came, chose his daughter over himself. Miranda, after a century of trying, could not make the same choice. Oswell E. Spencer. Oswell E. Spencer Earl built the most dangerous private corporation in human history and spent the rest of his long, declining life hiding from what it had become. He co-founded Umbrella Corporation in the 1960s alongside James Marcus and Brandon Bailey after their discovery of the progenitor virus, a mutagenic pathogen harvested from the Sonnentrep flower cultivated by the Ndopaya people of Africa for generations. And from that discovery, he constructed a vision of human evolution that was, in its own monstrous logic, internally consistent. Spencer believed the progenitor virus could be used to trigger a selective extinction event. Most of humanity would die, but a genetically superior remnant would survive and be shaped by Spencer into a new civilization with himself as its immortal sovereign. He was not in his own mind a monster. He was a god in waiting. The scale of ambition required to build that belief, to look at the progenitor virus and see not a biological hazard but an instrument of human curation, is precisely what made Spencer the most dangerous person in the franchise's lore. He wasn't reactive. He planned decades in advance and operated simultaneously across research, corporate, political, and military domains to position Umbrella as the most advanced private bioweapons developer on Earth. The key players who opposed Spencer directly were, most consequentially, Albert Wesker, one of the chosen children Spencer had enrolled in an elite training program, alongside William Birkin and others selected from specific genetic lineages for their potential superiority. Spencer had essentially built a breeding program disguised as a school, then a career path, then a research institution, funneling these children through Umbrella until the best among them could serve as the raw material for his new humanity. In 2006, Wesker arrived at Spencer's European estate and was met by an old man in a wheelchair who had waited decades to deliver the revelation in person, that Wesker was not the heir Spencer had chosen. He was the prototype Spencer intended to supersede. Wesker's response was to kill Spencer immediately, taking ownership of the plan and discarding the man who built it. It was, from a certain angle, exactly what Spencer's philosophy had always implied was acceptable. The lore connectivity of Oswell E. Spencer is simply that he is the root node of the franchise's entire conspiracy. The Spencer Mansion, the Asteris team deliberately assembled to be used as test data, the Raccoon City Underground Lab, the Umbrella training programs, the distribution of prototype viruses to researchers, every element of the franchise's first 20 years of story traces back to his decisions. He commissioned a mansion to house experiments, had its architect imprisoned inside it to keep the location secret, and spent decades running a pharmaceutical corporation that was, in its entirety, a cover for viral weapons research. He died in 2006 before seeing his plan succeed or fail, which is perhaps the most fitting conclusion available to a man who spent his life trying to control outcomes he was never going to live to see, Albert Wesker. Albert Wesker is the franchise's most enduring villain because he is the one who understood every other villain's mistake and still made his own. Enrolled in Spencer's training program as a child alongside William Birkin, Wesker spent his early career as an Umbrella researcher and then as the deliberately placed captain of STSRS Alpha Team, a position that existed not to keep Raccoon City safe, but to expose STARS members to the Spencer Mansion's BOWs under combat conditions and transmit that data to Umbrella. In RE1, 1998, Wesker betrayed his team, injected himself with a prototype virus he'd secretly prepared, and survived an encounter with the Tyrant by faking his death. The virus gave him superhuman physical capabilities, enhanced strength, speed, and regeneration, and made him functionally impossible to kill through conventional means. What followed was a career of independent bioterrorism, pursued with professional efficiency and almost no visible ego until the very end. Wesker worked with the rival organization HCF to steal the G-virus. He deployed Ada Wong to RE4's Los Illuminados operation to retrieve a Las Plagas sample. He cultivated Krauser, Excellagione, and various other assets across multiple continents. He absorbed Umbrella's remaining research data after the corporation's legal collapse and used it as the foundation for projects that exceeded what Umbrella itself had managed. He maintained the appearance of a ghost, present everywhere in Umbrella's collapse, responsible for its aftermath, never directly confrontable, while simultaneously working with Tricell to develop the Ouroboros project in Africa, the final refinement of Spencer's original vision, a virus that would kill indiscriminately and leave only those few whose biology could adapt to it. By the events of RE5, 2009, he had positioned himself to inject Ouroboros, a virus combining progenitor properties with further mutations, into the global atmosphere using a strategic bomber. The plan was Spencer's plan, refined: reduce the human population to a superior remnant that would inherit a world Wesker controlled. Chris Redfield and Shiva Alomar pursued him to Africa through Kijuju, through Tricell's underground lab, and finally into a volcanic caldera where Wesker, having injected himself with an experimental overdose of Ouroboros and PG67AW, a suppressant Excella had contaminated, became something between a person and a force of nature, and was finally killed by multiple rocket launcher strikes as lava closed around him. The key players in Wesker's destruction were Chris Redfield, whose encounter with Wesker at the Spencer Mansion in 1998 initiated a decade-long antagonism across 2 continents and multiple operations, and Jill Valentine, who spent years as Wesker's involuntary test subject, kept alive, experimented on, used as living data, before Chris found her and freed her in time to assist in the African campaign. Shiva Alomar, a Bassaye operative and native of Kijuju, who had her own history with Umbrella's African operations, completed the unit that finally cornered Wesker in the environment he'd chosen for his apocalyptic demonstration. Their final confrontation is the franchise's most consequential boss fight, not just because of the stakes, but because it closed the Umbrella era definitively and made it necessary for every subsequent story to find new sources of horror to replace what Wesker had represented. Everything after RE5 is either cleaning up Wesker's mess or trying to become what Wesker was. The lore connectivity of Albert Wesker is total. He is the connective tissue between the Umbrella era and everything that followed it. His death removed the franchise's most capable operator and left a power vacuum that Los Illuminados, The Connections, Neo Umbrella, and Mother Miranda's organization all rushed to fill in the following decade. Every villain after Wesker is, in some sense, Wesker's legacy. The chaos he helped create, the technology he helped develop, the institutional knowledge he absorbed from Umbrella's collapse and dispersed into the black market before dying. He built an era of global bioterrorism so comprehensively that it outlasted him by more than a decade, and it is still outlasting him in 2021 when Ethan Winters is sacrificing himself on a mountain in Eastern Europe because of chains of causality that run unbroken. Back to a man who faked his death in a burning mansion in 1998, William Birkin. William Birkin was, by any professional measure, the most brilliant virologist Umbrella Corporation ever employed. And the fact that Umbrella Corporation employed him is the closest thing Resident Evil has to a systemic critique of the relationship between genius and institutional complicity. Birkin joined Umbrella's research program alongside Wesker in their youth, and spent decades working at the Raccoon City underground facility, developing the G-Virus, a mutagenic strain with properties the T-Virus couldn't approach. The ability to not just transform a host, but to rewrite their biology continuously, incorporating foreign genetic material, spawning embryos in other hosts to spread the infection, and producing a series of increasingly alien mutations that bore less and less resemblance to the original human form. His downfall was loyalty, not to Umbrella, but to his work. When Umbrella sent a retrieval team to take his G-Virus research in 1998, Birkin refused to yield it. He was shot. In the moments before he died from his wounds, he injected himself with the G-Virus, transforming immediately into a G1 mutation, recognizably Birkin, but with one massively overdeveloped arm and an eye embedded in his shoulder. The retrieval team was slaughtered. A wounded Birkin staggered through the underground facility's rat-accessible environments, and the G-Virus contaminated the rat population, which spread it into Raccoon City's water supply and sewer system. The citywide zombie outbreak of September-October 1998 was caused, at its most mechanistic level, by the dying convulsions of one man's refusal to let his work be taken away. The key players in Birkin's eventual destruction were Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, 2 civilians who entered Raccoon City on September 29th and spent the night encountering progressively more monstrous versions of a man they'd never met. Birkin's mutations proceeded from G1 through G5, each stage less recognizable than the last. The final form a massive centipede-like organism with no remaining humanoid features. He also killed his wife Annette during one of his transformation cycles, leaving their daughter Sherry Birkin, infected with a G-virus embryo, to be rescued by Claire. The lore connectivity of William Birkin is the G-virus itself, which cascades through the rest of the franchise in ways Birkin couldn't have planned and didn't survive to witness. His daughter Sherry carries a suppressed G-virus strain in her blood that grants accelerated healing, making her a unique research asset and eventually a government operative. The G-virus's properties, its adaptive mutation, its embryo-based transmission, its capacity for continuous biological self-revision, influenced subsequent researchers' work on every major strain that followed. The Raccoon City incident itself, directly caused by Birkin's desperate self-injection, was the public demonstration of Umbrella's worst-case scenario that forced global governments to acknowledge the threat of private bioweapon development. Birkin's personal catastrophe became Umbrella's corporate death sentence. He destroyed a city to protect what he'd built. The franchise spent the next 20 years dealing with what that destruction set loose. Alexia Ashford. Alexia Ashford was 12 years old when she injected herself with the T. Veronica virus she had created and had herself cryogenically frozen, intending to sleep for 15 years, while the virus gradually integrated with her biology, rather than killing her as rapid integration killed every other test subject. This is the cleanest possible summary of what made Alexia Ashford different from every other Resident Evil villain. She was a child prodigy who treated her own body as the final stage of her research, planned her transformation with the patience of a scientist and the ego of someone who had been told she was the most intelligent human being on Earth since approximately age 5, and woke up in December 1998 as something that was no longer entirely human and was entirely fine with that. Alexia's narrative core is the T. Veronica project, a hybrid virus she created by combining the progenitor virus with the genetic material of queen ants, producing a strain capable of giving its host control over insects, the ability to generate and project fire, and the capacity to bend other T. Veronica hosts to their will. The ant queen principle applied to human biology, the hive as a model for fascistic biological control at the individual scale. She experimented on her own father, Alexander Ashford, using him as an early T. Veronica test subject and producing the Nosferatu that Chris Redfield encountered in the Antarctic base. Her twin brother Alfred spent 15 years maintaining the illusion of her presence on Rockfort Island and the Antarctic facility, his loyalty to her consuming whatever independent identity he might have developed. The isolation of their Antarctic operation, deeply hidden, funded through Umbrella's institutional structure while operating outside it, gave Alexia the same insulation from outside interference that Spencer had built into the Spencer mansion. She woke up believing she had built something no one could take from her. She was wrong by about 8 hours. The key players in Alexia's defeat were Chris Redfield, who arrived at the Antarctic base after his own capture in pursuit of Claire, and, indirectly, Albert Wesker, who came to the same location to retrieve T. Veronica. Wesker's arrival confirmed the virus's strategic value. Chris's combat engagement ended Alexia's emergence before she could secure that value for herself. Steve Burnside's infection with T. Veronica during the Rockfort Island events served as a demonstration of the strain's effects on a non-adapted host, the rapid mutation, the brief period of monstrous power, and the death that followed, providing a data point on T. Veronica's ceiling that Alexia's own case was designed to transcend. The lore connectivity of Alexia Ashford is her role as proof of concept for virus as enhancement rather than virus as weapon. Where the T-virus and G-virus primarily produced monstrous transformations in their hosts, T. Veronica demonstrated that with sufficient patience and biological self-experimentation, a virus could produce controlled enhancement in a single designated subject, a concept that would be pursued, adapted, and catastrophically applied by Wesker himself in the following decade. Alexia was right about the theory. The slow integration method worked. She emerged with genuine superhuman capability rather than monstrous degradation. She was simply killed before she could do anything substantial with being right, which is perhaps the franchise's cleanest statement about what scientific brilliance produces when it's paired with complete contempt for every other living thing. Nemesis. Nemesis is not a person. This is worth establishing before anything else, because Nemesis presents as a person. 7 feet of armored muscle, a scarred face, a trench coat, the capacity capacity for tactical decision-making and weapons use, and the horror of Nemesis is precisely the way these human qualities are wrapped around something that has no human interests whatsoever. The Enia-type parasite, developed by Umbrella Europe and implanted into an advanced T-103 Tyrant model, produced the first BOW capable of intelligent goal pursuit, tool use, and adaptive tactics. Nemesis could use a rocket launcher. Nemesis could command other infected as a force multiplier. Nemesis could read a situation and make a decision about how to respond to it. These capabilities made Nemesis the most sophisticated weapon Umbrella had ever deployed, and Umbrella deployed it against one person. The narrative core of Nemesis's deployment is the specificity of its targeting. It was sent to Raccoon City in 1998 with a single operational directive: eliminate STRS members, not civilians, not infected. STRS specifically, the law enforcement team whose surviving members had accumulated first-hand evidence of Umbrella's activities. Every dead STRS member was a closed mouth. Nemesis pursued Jill Valentine across Raccoon City with the patience of something that doesn't get tired and doesn't change its mind, using the chaos of the zombie outbreak as cover for what was functionally an assassination campaign. The key players in Nemesis's eventual destruction were Jill Valentine and, in the RE3 remake, Carlos Oliveira, UBCS mercenary who started the crisis as an Umbrella contractor and ended it fighting against his employer's flagship weapon. Jill, infected with a T-virus strain administered by Nemesis and cured by Carlos's efforts to synthesize a vaccine, confronted the final Nemesis form, massively mutated, the trench coat and tactical intelligence long gone, the parasite's growth consuming the T-103 chassis into something barely recognizable, with a rail cannon she found in the Nest 2 facility. The final shot was not a moment of triumph, it was extermination. The lore connectivity of Nemesis is what it demonstrated to the rest of the world watching Raccoon City burn. The existence of a BOW capable of intelligent target selection, weapons use, and coordinated pursuit was the proof that Umbrella's technology had achieved something governments would spend billions to replicate. Every subsequent organization that acquired Umbrella's research, every black market dealer, every terrorist cell, every nation-state bioweapon program was chasing what Nemesis represented. The T-virus produced zombies. Nemesis produced a soldier. That distinction changed what bioweapons development looked like for the next 20 years. Neo-Umbrella's C-virus enhanced Plaga-based mutations would attempt to replicate what Nemesis accomplished in a more scalable format. Wesker's subsequent work with human enhancement was partly downstream of the data Nemesis generated during its Raccoon City deployment. Nemesis was not a villain in the traditional sense. It was a weapons test that happened to be pointed at people, and the test results were catastrophically successful. Osmond Sadler. Osmond Sadler understood something about power that Umbrella's corporate hierarchy never quite grasped. Loyalty purchased through ideology is more durable than loyalty purchased through salary. The Los Illuminados were not employees. They were believers. When Sadler retrieved the ancient Las Plagas parasite from ruins beneath the Spanish village, his cult controlled and distributed it among the population, producing the Ganados, controlled hosts who retained enough motor function and group coordination to function as infantry, while being entirely subject to Sadler's direction through the master Plaga he carried. He had built an army that couldn't quit, couldn't defect, and couldn't be bribed away. His plan was to infect the U.S. President's daughter, Ashley Graham, with a Plaga, return her to American soil, and use her as the vector through which key U.S. government officials would be exposed. If it worked, Sadler would have effectively infiltrated the world's most powerful government with a biological control agent. The scale of what this would have accomplished, an executive branch operating under Plaga influence, military assets potentially compromised, policy shaped by a cult leader operating from rural Spain, made Sadler's operation one of the most strategically ambitious bioterror plots in the franchise's history, and one of the least dependent on the kind of mass casualties that Umbrella's methods inevitably produced. He wasn't trying to destroy civilization. He was trying to own it, quietly, from the inside. That distinction made him arguably more dangerous than the virologists who came before him, a biological coup rather than a biological catastrophe. The key players in Sadler's defeat were Leon Kennedy, assigned by by the U.S. government to recover Ashley, and Ada Wong, who was simultaneously operating in the same location on behalf of Wesker's interests. Leon's combat engagement with Sadler throughout the isolated region, through village, castle, military compound, and finally the island laboratory, led to a final confrontation where Sadler's Las Plagas produced a monstrous transformation, a vast spider-like form with a vulnerable eye that emerged from his body during combat. Ada provided Leon with a special rocket launcher for the final shot, completing her assignment to retrieve the Plaga sample and leaving Leon to provide the kill. The lore connectivity of Osmond Sadler is the Las Plagas strain itself, which exited the incident in Ada Wong's hands, and from there into Wesker's network. The properties of the Plaga, its controlled infection, its host-preserving mechanics, the capacity for mass behavioral control without mass death, represented a different philosophy of bioweapon design than the T-virus or G-virus, and influenced subsequent development of Plaga-derived strains in RE6's bioterror campaigns. Sadler's ambition died with him in the island facility's explosion. His methodology didn't. Jack Krauser. Jack Krauser represents a specific kind of tragedy the franchise rarely revisits. The soldier who discovered that the institutions he served were more interested in the tools of war than in the people who used them. A decorated U.S. military operative whose career was effectively ended by a severe arm injury sustained during a classified 2002 mission, the same mission that produced Leon Kennedy's early government service. Krauser found himself discarded by the apparatus he'd given years to. He didn't accept this quietly. He contacted Albert Wesker. Wesker's offer was enhancement, purpose, and directional clarity. Krauser's natural combat talent, combined with Wesker's resources and a Plaga-derived mutation that restructured his left arm into a hardened, blade-capable biological weapon, made him exactly the kind of operative independent bioterror networks needed and conventional militaries couldn't produce. Wesker positioned him within Sadler's Los Illuminados as a double agent, tasked with facilitating the kidnapping of Ashley Graham, while secretly ensuring that a Plaga sample reached Wesker at the operation's conclusion, rather than remaining under Sadler's control. The key player in Krauser's death was Leon Kennedy, his former mission partner, the other man who had been present in 2002, the point of departure between two possible responses to institutional abandonment. Leon stayed, Krauser left. Their eventual confrontation in RE4's island facility, culminating in a hand-to-hand knife fight among the ruins, was the franchise's clearest statement about loyalty and its costs. Leon won. Krauser's assessment of what the world owed him, balanced against what Leon's persistent belief in something worth protecting had cost him, was settled in that fight. The lore connectivity of Jack Krauser is more personal than systemic. He didn't change the bioweapon landscape the way Birkin or Wesker did. What he demonstrated was the human supply chain underneath the biological one. The former military personnel, the discarded operatives, the people with specialized skills and grievances who became the delivery mechanism for Wesker's network and others like it. The infrastructure that produced Krauser, elite military training, classified operations, institutional abandonment, was exactly what every subsequent bioterror network went looking for when it needed human assets who could operate in hostile environments without leaving traces back to their employers. Every subsequent mercenary, every recruited defector, every combat specialist who showed up on the wrong side of a RE plot traces back to the same mechanism Krauser represented: a skilled person, an injury or a betrayal, and an offer from someone who knew how to make use of what institutional discard left behind. RE6's bioterror campaigns would operate on exactly this model at scale. Krauser was the proof of concept. Eveline. Eveline was a little girl who wanted a family, and every single thing wrong with the last chapter of the franchise's Umbrella-era legacy can be located in the 17 words of that sentence. She was designated E001 by the Connections, a criminal organization that operated in the black market space that Umbrella's collapse had created, and she was a next-generation bioweapon built around the mold, a substance derived from and functionally related to the same fungal biology that Mother Miranda had been cultivating in her European village for a century. Eveline produced the mold naturally, could infect others through contact and exposure, and could control the infected through the mold's interconnected biological network. She looked like a child. She thought like something that had never been taught that other people's inner lives were real. Her operational failure, from the Connections' perspective, began aboard the transport vessel meant to deliver her to a new facility. She escaped containment, caused the ship to crash in the Louisiana Bayou, and proceeded to do exactly what she had been designed not to do. operate independently, pursuing her own psychological objective rather than the strategic one her creators had built her for. She infected the Baker family, Jack, Margaret, and Lucas Baker, and her handler Mia Winters, creating a controlled household around herself that would function as the family she had never been designed to want. For 3 years, the Bakers existed as Eveline's captives, not dead, not free, performing domesticity under biological compulsion while their daughter Zoe and, eventually, Ethan Winters tried to find a way out. The irony that Eveline, an expensive strategic bioweapon built for geopolitical deployment, spent 3 years running what amounted to a deeply dysfunctional Louisiana household is the franchise's most darkly comic observation about the gap between institutional planning and biological reality. The key players in Eveline's destruction were Ethan Winters, who arrived looking for Mia in 2017 and spent the events of RE7 navigating the consequences of Eveline's infection, and Mia Winters herself, whose history with Eveline as her handler gave her a complex complicity in the disaster. Lucas Baker, who the Connections had separately recruited as an informant and who retained some independent agency while the rest of his family suffered under Eveline's control, served as an antagonist within the household, using Eveline's infrastructure against her and against Ethan simultaneously, providing the Connections with data on Eveline's development while watching his parents deteriorate. Jack Baker, in his moments of lucidity between transformations, was trying to protect his daughter Zoe and ask Ethan for help. Margaret Baker had lost whatever remained of herself. The household that Eveline had built to satisfy her need for family was the franchise's most complete portrait of what a bioweapon designed to feel loved actually looks like when you're on the inside of it. Ethan killed Eveline with a synthesis derived from her own cellular material, targeting the mold network through its creator. The lore connectivity of Eveline is twofold. Her biology attracted Mother Miranda's attention directly. The megamycete in Eveline's mold were close enough to Miranda's research that she sought the connection, and the events of RE Village are partially downstream of Miranda's interest in what the Connections built. More broadly, Eveline's existence demonstrated that Umbrella's collapse had not ended the production of catastrophic bioweapons. It had privatized it. The Connections, Neo Umbrella, and the various other organizations that filled the vacuum Umbrella left behind produced horrors that were functionally equivalent to what Umbrella had built, without the inconvenient corporate oversight. Eveline was what happened when the franchise's worst technology passed into the hands of people with no accountability structures at all. She wanted a family. The franchise spent 2 games explaining what that cost everyone who got close to her. Resident Evil has been running for nearly 30 years, and in that time, it has built one of the most genuinely interesting rosters of protagonists in all of gaming. Not because they're the strongest, or the most tactical, or the most emotionally stable, because almost none of them were supposed to be here. These are the people the franchise handed the end of the world to, and they all kept showing up anyway. Here's how each of them got there. Chris Redfield. Chris Redfield walked into the Spencer Mansion in July 1998 carrying his Beretta 92FS Samurai Edge, a custom-fitted sidearm issued to senior STRS Alpha team members, against bioweapons the size of refrigerators, against things that used to be dogs. Here's the thing, Chris had no idea what he was walking into. He was a STRS Alpha team member, the guy you send when something goes wrong in the woods, not the guy you send when the woods have been replaced by a corporate bioweapons lab with a trophy zombie collection. He survived 72 hours of continuous combat with basically nothing. Scavenged tools, basic first aid, and whatever adrenaline his body had left. At one point, he stitched his own abdominal wound using dental tools from the estate's infirmary. Regular people pass out getting blood drawn. Chris used the estate dentist's kit on himself mid-mission and kept moving, which is, not ideal. That same night, a zombie scratched him in the underground lab, direct T-virus exposure. He walked it off. 5 years later, that man co-founded the BSAA, a global anti-bioterrorism organization built so nothing like the Spencer Mansion would happen again. By Resident Evil 5, his standard loadout included an FN-P90 with 50-round helical magazines. That is the loadout of a man who has completely stopped being surprised by monsters. Someone who looked at the Beretta situation and said, never again. Chris isn't the most complicated protagonist in this franchise. His arc isn't about identity or moral compromise. It's about escalating commitment. Every game raises the stakes, and Chris just keeps showing up with bigger guns. Every other protagonist on this list is a variation on the same question Chris answered in 1998. What do you do when the nightmare doesn't end? You buy a better gun and you go back in. Speaking of people who walked into the Spencer Mansion with completely inadequate equipment, Jill Valentine did the same thing, and she did it with a harder route. Jill Valentine. Jill Valentine is statistically the most repeatedly unlucky person in the entire Resident Evil franchise, and she's also the only one whose immune system became a corporate obsession. Here's the thing, most survivors in this franchise are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jill was specifically sought out. Albert Wesker didn't want to kill her, he wanted to use her. That's a fundamentally different kind of horror, and it's what separates her from every other protagonist on this list. It starts on July 23rd, 1998. STRS Alpha Team deploys to the Arklay Mountains, and Jill arrives at the Spencer Mansion carrying her own Beretta 92FS Samurai Edge, the same class of custom weapon issued to Alpha Team members. She survived, which is either a testament to her abilities or proof that the universe simply refused to let her die in peace. She then survived Raccoon City collapsing in 1998, 2 outbreaks, back to back within the same year. Most people don't survive one, but here's where it gets complicated. The BSAA filed medical records in January 2000 documenting her PTSD diagnosis, citing recurring nightmares and hypervigilance following Raccoon City. She kept fighting anyway, not because she shrugged it off, but in spite of the fact that she hadn't. That distinction matters. Then, in 2006, during a raid on the Spencer estate, Wesker arrived and Jill tackled him through a window to save Chris. Neither body was recovered. For the next 2.5 years, Jill was held captive by Wesker, who had discovered something extraordinary. Her prior T-virus exposure had generated antibodies that were uniquely useful in his Ouroboros research. He wasn't done with her yet. Her body became the biological foundation for the most dangerous virus he ever developed. She was controlled via a P-30 drug device attached to her chest and deployed against her own allies until Chris and Sheva finally removed the device in 2009 and brought her back. By Resident Evil 3, her loadout had evolved to a custom Beretta with enhanced stopping power and a G18C machine pistol for close engagements. Which makes sense. When you've learned that zombies are genuinely the least of your problems, you upgrade accordingly, and if Jill's bad day started with the wrong field assignment, wait until you hear about the rookie cop who showed up to his first day of work and accidentally stumbled into the apocalypse. Leon S. Kennedy. Leon S. Kennedy showed up to his first day of work on September 29th, 1998, and Raccoon City had already decided it was done existing. That is not an exaggeration. His patrol route started, the T-virus outbreak hit its peak, and he had not completed a single shift before the city became a biological catastrophe he would spend the next decade cleaning up. His starting loadout was a Matilda, a 9mm handgun with a standard magazine. The kind of thing you carry when the worst case scenario is a shoplifter, not a city full of reanimated civilians trying to eat your face. Here's the thing about Leon's arc. It's basically a joke about terrible timing that stops being funny and starts being tragic about halfway through. He didn't choose bioterrorism, it chose him. On day one, before he'd even filed paperwork. But the rookie thing is only half the story. By 2004, he was operating as a US government agent with direct presidential clearance, deployed solo into rural Spain to extract the president's daughter. The guy who showed up to his first shift, barely armed, became one of the most trusted field operatives in the country. His weapon loadout reflects exactly that shift. The Matilda gave way to a customized handgun with laser sight and stock attachment, which is less I am surviving this and more I have done this enough times to have preferences. And here's where it gets genuinely complicated. In that same 2004 mission, Leon was captured and directly infected with the Las Plagas parasite by Osman Sadler. He spent the remainder of that operation carrying an active parasite in his body while simultaneously trying to extract Ashley Graham and dismantle the entire cult infrastructure around him. He got the parasite removed at the end, which is good because the alternative was becoming a mind-controlled servant of a Spanish religious extremist, which is, not ideal. The transition from overwhelmed rookie to ice-cold operative is the part the game's never quite addressed directly. Leon functions. He's precise. He's effective. He's exactly what the government needed him to become. Whether becoming that was good for him is a different question entirely, and one nobody in his chain of command seems particularly interested in asking. Claire Redfield, meanwhile, was doing all of this without a government salary or a clearance level, which honestly makes her story hit differently. Claire Redfield. Claire Redfield arrived in Raccoon City on September 29, 1998, riding a Harley-Davidson motorcycle looking for her brother. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't an agent. She was a college student who showed up as the outbreak peaked, armed with a Browning HP and absolutely zero preparation for what was waiting for her. That's the thing about Claire that the franchise never quite lets you sit with. Every other protagonist on this list had some version of training, credentials, or institutional backing. Claire had a leather jacket and a handful of rounds. The rest she figured out from whatever the city's dead left behind, which is how you end up wielding a grenade launcher at the end of Resident Evil 2. Not because you planned it that way, but because survival has its own curriculum. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. During the Rockford Island escape, she survived multiple explosions, exposure to fire, and environments that would hospitalize most people. No recovery arc, no cutscene dedicated to it. She just kept moving, which is either inspiring or deeply concerning, depending on how much you think about it. But the biology of Claire's story is what really separates her from the rest of the list. During the 2011 TerraSave facility incident on Suchestvovani Island, she was exposed to the T-Phobos virus and spent days contagious before her body suppressed it through sheer emotional regulation. T-Phobos activates on fear, and Claire refused to give in to it. Her body essentially did the research so she didn't have to, which is, not ideal as a survival mechanism, but it worked. What she did with all of that is the part nobody talks about enough. Claire joined TerraSave, a civilian humanitarian organization built specifically to respond to corporate bioweapon programs. She didn't go work for the government, she didn't join the BSAA, she committed to civilian advocacy because she watched what happened when the institutions meant to protect people either failed or actively caused the damage. Every other protagonist on this list ends their arc by becoming better at fighting. Claire's ends with her trying to make sure other people never have to fight at all. That's the only character development in this franchise that lands somewhere other than a bigger gun. And then there's the one who was doing all of this at 18 on her very first field assignment, while also building a cure from scratch. Rebecca Chambers. Rebecca Chambers is either the most underrated protagonist in the entire franchise, or proof that everyone who plays these games has been paying attention to completely the wrong person. Let me explain. She's 18 years old. She's the team medic, not a frontline soldier. And while every combat-trained STRS veteran in that mansion was busy emptying magazines into zombies and generally just trying not to die, Rebecca Chambers was in the laboratory solving the underlying problem. On July 24th, 1998, under active zombie siege conditions, she synthesized a treatment from plant alkaloids. She found in the Spencer Mansion's own lab, not a commercial-grade cure, but a working antidote capable of slowing early-stage viral mutation before it became irreversible. She built it from scratch, alone, while things with no faces were trying to eat her, which is, not ideal working conditions for a biochemist. Here's the thing about Rebecca that nobody talks about. She came prepared in a way the combat veterans absolutely did not. Her medical bag contained a substantial field pharmacy, serum vials, trauma kits, specialized anti-venom. The soldiers brought guns, Rebecca brought medicine, and she needed it. She sustained infected scratches during Bravo Team's initial Arclay encounter, requiring constant antibiotic injections just to stop herself from turning. She was treating herself while treating everyone else, while synthesizing a cure while surviving. The multitasking alone is exhausting to think about. Her antidote wasn't just theoretically useful either. It's the treatment used in Resident Evil Zero's epilogue to successfully slow Billy Cohen's exposure. The medic built the most functional countermeasure against the T-virus the franchise has ever shown on screen. Then she joined the US Army's Chemical Corps in 2000 and made captain by 2005. Of course she did. Ada Wong is a different story entirely. Harder to read, harder to trust, and operating on motivations that nobody fully understands, including, arguably, Ada Wong is the only person on this list who has been more identities than she has been a person. That sounds like a dramatic way to open a section, and it absolutely is, but hear me out, because the evidence is right there in front of you across 6 games and 25 years of franchise history. Not a side character, not an ally, a professional who has never once let you fully see what she actually is, and has been doing it since 1998. Her first documented operation put her in Raccoon City on September 29th, 1998, the same day Leon Kennedy showed up, but where Leon was there because it was his first day on the job, Ada was there because she was working. She'd been sent to retrieve G-virus samples, operating under a cover deep enough that nobody around her knew what she actually was. Not a survivor, not a hero, an asset running a retrieval operation in the middle of a city that was actively dissolving. Her loadout reflects this exactly. No signature firearm she's carried since the beginning, no sentimental attachment to a particular weapon. She adapts. By Resident Evil 4, she's using a custom handgun and a grappling hook device she deploys with the kind of casual efficiency that makes you realize this is not her first hostile environment. Whatever works for the current job, that's not a character quirk, that's a philosophy. By the events of Resident Evil 4, she's transporting a Las Plagas sample she retrieved on behalf of Wesker. Not a souvenir, a biological payload, the kind of thing arms dealers move, the kind of thing that ends cities. And she does it while simultaneously working against the people who hired her, feeding Leon information, and walking out of Spain with everything she came for. That's the thing about Ada. She always walks out with everything she came for. Here's where it gets interesting though. Across every appearance, she is never fully explained. Her true name, her actual allegiances, her real motivations, classified, in-universe, and to the player. Resident Evil 6 gives you an entire campaign from her perspective, and still doesn't answer the core questions. The writers aren't forgetting to fill in the gaps. The gaps are the characterization. The ambiguity isn't a flaw in Ada's writing. It's the whole point. You don't get access to the person underneath the cover, because there may not be a version of her that exists outside of one. Which is almost refreshing, honestly. Carlos Oliveira, by contrast, wears everything on his sleeve, which made his situation considerably messier to survive. Carlos Oliveira walked into Raccoon City as a UBCS operative during the worst urban bioweapon disaster in American history. Most people spend their first real deployment figuring out the basics. Carlos spent his figuring out how to not die in a city that was actively eating itself alive. The Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service dropped him into Raccoon City during the September 1998 outbreak. He was technically working for the company that caused it. That detail matters. Carlos wasn't a hero who stumbled into a nightmare. He was a mercenary on Umbrella's payroll, dropped into the consequences of Umbrella's experiments, and the game is honest enough not to pretend that's a comfortable position to be in. His initial reluctance to help civilians wasn't a writing oversight. It was baked into who he was at that point in the story. He was there to do a job, not run a rescue operation, and that tension is what makes him interesting. A lot of protagonists in this franchise were always going to do the right thing. Carlos had to choose it. Here's where it gets genuinely impressive. His survival across the outbreak wasn't clean or heroic in the traditional sense. His unit got decimated. Most of his squad mates didn't make it out. Carlos kept moving anyway, pushing through a city that was actively collapsing around him, with zero institutional support and a chain of command that had already abandoned the operation. But the detail that flips everything is the T-virus infection. After Jill Valentine collapses from Nemesis's attack and falls into a coma, Carlos is the one who fights through the RPD to find a cure for her. He's not rescuing the helpless civilian. He's saving the person who, by any reasonable measure, is more capable than he is. The rescue dynamic runs completely backwards, and the game just lets that sit there without making a big thing of it. He goes out, he gets her the vaccine, and he does it while the city is hours away from being erased from the map. After Raccoon City, Carlos disappears from the main narrative, his later fate left largely open. The mercenary who took a bad paycheck watched his entire unit die, and still made the right calls at the end. It's one of the cleanest arcs in the franchise, and nobody talks about it nearly enough. Sherry Birkin's story starts at the same moment as Leon and Claire's, and in a lot of ways it's even more complicated because she didn't choose any of it. Sherry Birkin. Sherry Birkin's entire story is about decisions other people made about her body before she was old enough to understand what a body even was. Here's how it starts. September 29th, 1998. Raccoon City sewers. Sherry is a child running from monsters through underground tunnels, which is already one of the worst sentences in this entire video. Her father, William Birkin, consumed by the G-virus and operating on pure biological imperative, implants a G-virus embryo inside her. The man he used to be no longer exists in any meaningful sense. What's left moves on instinct, driven by the virus's drive to reproduce in a genetically compatible host. His closest genetic match is his own daughter. That makes Sherry the youngest documented bioweapon exposure in the franchise's history, which is a record nobody should want to hold. But here's where it gets complicated. Sherry didn't mutate. Her immature immune system responded to the virus in a way no adult immune system could replicate, accidentally creating the most durable viral resistance in the franchise. Her childhood biology, the exact thing that made her vulnerable in the first place, is what kept her alive. Her father's experiment failed because she was too young for it to work properly. Leon and Claire extracted the embryo in time, but the exposure wasn't clean. The G-Virus had already done something to her cellular structure, something that didn't go away when the embryo did. Sherry walked out of Raccoon City alive, but she walked out changed, and the people who were very interested in what she'd become were already making phone calls. The US government put Sherry under observation almost immediately after the city's destruction. For years, she was effectively a ward of the state, her body treated as a research asset as much as a person who needed looking after, which is, not ideal as a way to grow up. By the events of Resident Evil 6, she's an adult working for the Division of Security Operations, specializing in bioweapon countermeasures. The survivor of her father's experiment became the government's leading expert on the experiment. There's something genuinely bittersweet about that. She is, objectively, the most qualified person alive to fight the thing that was done to her, because the thing that was done to her never fully went away. Every step of Sherry's life was shaped by someone else's choice. Her father's ambition, the government's interest in what her survival meant. She didn't choose any of it. She just survived it and then built a career out of the wreckage. That's either inspiring or devastating, depending on how long you think about it. Ethan Winters, coming up next, has his own version of this story, except his starts with a door he probably should not have opened. Ethan Winters. Ethan Winters is the most unremarkable person in this entire franchise. No military background, no government clearance, no special operations training, systems engineer, civilian. The kind of guy who probably had a gym membership he never used, and a fantasy football team he cared about too much, and his body became the most extraordinary biological case study Resident Evil has ever produced. Here's where it starts. In 2017, Ethan drives to a derelict plantation in Dolby, Louisiana because his wife sent him a message. After 3 years of being declared dead, he walks in, she attacks him, and then it just keeps going for 48 hours straight. A 9mm pistol and a survival knife against an entire plantation of molded creatures. No evac, no backup, no tactical training to fall back on. Just a civilian who refused to stop moving. Then Mia cuts his hand off with a chainsaw. And here's the thing about that, because he lost his hand, is underselling what actually happened. The mold that had been colonizing his biology regenerated the hand using bioorganic tissue. He did not lose the hand so much as accidentally upgrade it, which is, not ideal, but also extraordinary. What the games eventually reveal is that Ethan had actually died during his initial encounter with Jack Baker in that very first hour. The mold resurrected him. Every severed limb he reattached with a tube of first aid solution, every wound he walked off, every moment he kept moving through damage that would have killed anyone else, all of it was the mold doing the work. The most ordinary protagonist in the franchise had been running on borrowed biology the entire time, and didn't know it. By February 2021, when Village begins, the mold integration in his body had progressed to the point where his regenerated hand had developed the ability to physically shield Rose from threats before Ethan's conscious mind had even processed the danger. His own biology had started making protective decisions without him. The man who had no training, no special powers, no reason to survive any of this, had been so thoroughly transformed by everything he'd endured that his body was protecting his daughter on instinct, operating independently of his will. Director commentary confirmed Ethan was always the original human, not a mold clone, which makes every severed limb, every time he kept walking through something that should have killed him permanently, retroactively worse. He was a civilian who got quietly converted by a biological horror and never stopped moving toward his family anyway. Not because of training, not because of expertise, because Rose was at the end of it. Which makes what comes next hit differently, because Rose inherited everything her father went through and she didn't get a choice about any of it. Rosemary Winters. Every protagonist in this franchise had a moment before, a day they were normal. Chris had his career, Leon had his commute, even Ethan had a quiet life in Los Angeles before it all went sideways. Rosemary Winters had zero of that. She was born with the Megamycetes power already inside her, which means the horror didn't find her. She was born inside it. From infancy, she was already something different, something that made the BSAA nervous enough to monitor her entire childhood. Before she could understand what she was, organizations were already afraid of what she might become. Most babies learn to grip things around month 3. Rosemary skipped normal development milestones entirely and went straight to being a classified security concern, which is one way to grow up. Here's where it gets hard to sit with. Rosemary didn't just carry traces of the Megamai seat, she was its vessel. Her father Ethan, who spent Resident Evil 7 and Village being systematically destroyed and rebuilt by the mold, was functionally made of the stuff by the end, but even he was a product of exposure. Rosemary didn't survive a virus. She is, at a biological level, a being born from the Megamai seat itself, and the only reason she retained her humanity is because of Ethan's sacrifice, his calcification destroying the Megamai seat while allowing her to keep its power without being consumed by it. Ethan literally crystallized himself, gave up his entire existence, and that specific act is the reason his daughter exists as a person, and not a vessel for a fungal superorganism. He died before she was old enough to understand any of it. By her mid-teens, she had achieved enough control over her powers to generate protective barriers and manipulate the mold at will. Skills it took the entire franchise 25 years of protagonist suffering to build toward. The franchise started with trained soldiers getting torn apart by horrors they weren't prepared for. It ends with a teenager who was the horror, learning to use it on her own terms. And then there's the Shadows of Rose DLC, set inside the Megamai seat's consciousness. Rosemary willingly entered the mind of the thing she was born from, looking for a way to lose her powers, to be normal. The franchise began with veterans cracking under pressure. It ends with a teenager who had accumulated enough existential dread to want to cut out a piece of her own biology before finishing school. Rosemary is the terminus. Every exposure, every adaptation, every protagonist who survives something they shouldn't have, it all ends here, with a kid who inherited the full power of a fungal god and is still standing. Her father spent everything destroying the Megamai seat to protect her. She was already part of it. He just didn't know it yet. Resident Evil protagonists aren't just characters you play as. They're a living timeline of how an entire franchise has evolved over 30 years. From fixed camera, puzzle box horror, to first-person psychological dread, to full-blown action blockbusters. Today, I'm breaking down every major protagonist and what their journey tells us about the series itself, starting with the man who's been here since day one. Chris Redfield. Chris Redfield is the longest-running protagonist in Resident Evil history, and honestly, his arc alone could be its own video. He's been in more games, more redesigns, and more memes than any other character in the franchise. But here's the thing. Underneath all of that is a genuinely fascinating character evolution that most people completely overlook. Let me take you back to July 1998. Chris is a STARS Alpha Team marksman, highly competent, idealistic, militarily trained. He walks into the Spencer mansion alongside Jill Valentine, expecting a search and rescue mission. What he gets instead is a corporate bioweapons nightmare that changes his life forever. But at this point in the franchise, Chris is the baseline. He's the capable guy who will probably survive this. No deep internal conflict, no moral gray areas. Just a soldier doing his job. Then Code Veronica happens in December 1998, and everything starts to shift. Chris discovers his sister Claire has been captured on Rockford Island, and he goes after her. But the real turning point isn't the rescue, it's Wesker. His former captain is now a superhuman monster, and Chris can barely keep up. The developers made a deliberate choice here. They started bulking up Chris's character model to visually justify him competing with a guy who could punch through steel. Reasonable enough, right? But that design decision spiraled hard. By Resident Evil 5 and the BSAA era, Chris is operating in the Kijuju Autonomous Zone, looking like he bench presses helicopters for cardio. He'd participated in more BSAA missions than any of his peers at that point, and the cracks were forming. His tactics became increasingly aggressive. His partnership with Sheva Alomar was professional, sure, but it lacked the chemistry and history he had with Jill. You could feel something was off. The idealism was fading. And then Village happened in 2021, and the internet lost its mind. Slimmer build, completely different facial features. Fans immediately coined the hashtag #NotMyChrisRedfield, and the memes wrote themselves. But here's where it gets interesting. That redesign wasn't lazy or accidental. It was deliberate. Capcom wanted to present a more grounded, realistic man who had been worn down by decades of fighting. A man who was now willing to make ethically questionable calls for what he believed was the greater good. The guy who seemed to gun down Mia Winters in front of Ethan? That's not a glitch in his character. That's the destination. Chris Redfield's arc doesn't end with him saving the day and getting a medal. It ends with a man shaped by institutional corruption and personal trauma. Still fighting, but no longer certain he's entirely the good guy. He walked into the Spencer mansion as a hero. He walked out of Village college as something far more complicated, but if Chris is the franchise's emotional anchor, then the woman who stood beside him from the very beginning deserves her own spotlight. Jill Valentine. Most people boot up Resident Evil 3 and see an action game. A woman with a gun fighting a monster through a city. But here's what nobody registers. Before the game even starts, before Jill fires a single bullet, she's sitting in her apartment on September 27th, 1998, contemplating ending her own life. That's the psychological baseline for everything that follows. Jill Valentine was recruited to STARS in 1996 as the only woman on Wesker's Alpha team, and she wasn't there to fill a quota. She was a bomb disposal expert and lockpicking specialist who earned her place through raw competency. The original Resident Evil gave her agency from the very first frame. She wasn't a damsel. She wasn't a sidekick. She was a fully operational field agent who survived the Spencer Mansion on skill alone, but Raccoon City broke something in her. On September 28th, after choosing to fight instead of giving up, Jill spent days being hunted through collapsing streets by the Nemesis, a bioweapon designed specifically to kill STARS members. Not zombies stumbling around corners, a thinking, pursuing, adapting predator that followed her everywhere, and when it finally caught her at the clock tower and infected her, the damage went far deeper than physical. The T-virus scarred her body. The pursuit scarred her mind. Here's where it gets complicated. After Raccoon City, Jill didn't vanish. She spent months in isolation, suffering nightmares and PTSD-adjacent symptoms while investigating Umbrella's European facilities alongside Barry Burton. She converted that trauma into purpose. By the early 2000s, she had co-founded the BSAA, building institutional infrastructure designed to prevent what happened to her from happening to anyone else. The scars remain, but they became a framework for action rather than paralysis. Then Wesker took even that from her. Resident Evil 5 revealed that Jill had been captured and subjected to P-30 mind control drugs, forced to fight against her own allies and her own morality. For years she had zero autonomy, zero choice. Everything she'd built after Raccoon City, every coping mechanism, every piece of rebuilt identity, was stripped away. 6 years of rehabilitation followed before she could function again. But functioning and healing are two very different things. By the RE6 era, in 2013, Jill had developed a pattern of ignoring direct orders to assist survivors in the field, justifying it as preventing greater loss of life. Her superiors called it reckless, and honestly, it was. But it was also a woman trying desperately to atone for actions she couldn't control, making choices that felt like penance disguised as heroism. And this is what makes her trajectory so fascinating when you put it next to Chris. Same origin, same team, same mansion, completely different psychological destinations. Where Chris drifted toward moral compromise and questionable tactical decisions, Jill moved toward redemptive action at personal cost. The franchise never fully resolved which approach was right, maybe because there isn't a right answer when your entire worldview gets shattered before the age of 30. But if Jill's story is about trauma transforming into purpose, the next protagonist's story is about something entirely different, an ordinary person becoming extraordinary against their will. Leon S. Kennedy. Leon Kennedy showed up late to his first day of work and walked straight into the apocalypse. That's not an exaggeration. That's literally what happened. September 30th, 1998. 2 months after Chris and Jill barely survived the Spencer Mansion, Leon pulls into Raccoon City for his very first shift at the RPD, and the entire city is already gone. Zombies everywhere. No colleagues to meet. No orientation. No here's where the coffee machine is. Just a dead city and a gun he barely knows how to use. And here's the thing, that was intentional. Capcom deliberately built Leon with weaknesses. Every protagonist before him had military training, special forces experience, or some kind of tactical background. Leon had none of that. He was a rookie cop who hadn't even clocked in yet. His survival carried more dramatic weight precisely because he wasn't supposed to make it. You're not watching a trained operative handle a crisis. You're watching a normal guy figure it out in real time, and that made him instantly the most relatable character in the entire franchise. But the franchise wasn't going to let him stay relatable for long. Fast forward to 2002. Leon has been recruited into US Stratcom and deployed on covert operations in South America, hunting drug lord Javier Hidalgo alongside former special ops partner Jack Krauser, rookie cop to federal operative in 4 years. That's not a career change. That's a complete identity overhaul. Then comes Resident Evil 4 in 2005, and this is Leon at his absolute peak. He's assigned to rescue Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, in rural Spain. No backup, no extraction team, just him. A village full of cultists controlled by Las Plagas parasites instead of zombies, and Ada Wong showing up with motives that nobody, including Leon, can fully pin down. He gets infected with the parasite himself. He has to undergo extraction alongside Ashley. He still pulls it off. The Ada dynamic is central to understanding Leon as a character. He clearly has feelings for her. She clearly operates on her own agenda, and neither of them ever fully resolves it across any game they appear in together. That unresolved tension gives Leon something most action protagonists lose after their second outing: emotional vulnerability. It's the one thing preventing him from becoming just another hardened operator with a perfect jawline. But by Resident Evil 6 in 2012, the hardening is almost complete. Leon is mature, experienced, and tasked with shooting the infected president of the United States. And he does it. That's what years of bioterrorism exposure does to a person. The guy who couldn't find the RPD front desk is now executing the leader of the free world without hesitation. Recent leaks for Resident Evil Requiem describe Leon as a stylish, good-looking, mature man, which tracks. But here's the kicker. Developers reportedly considered making him the sole protagonist, before concluding that his accumulated experience made survival horror gameplay nearly impossible to justify narratively. He's become too competent to be scared. And honestly, that might be the most telling piece of character development in the entire franchise. The series literally cannot make him vulnerable anymore. They built an everyman, then spent 6 games systematically removing every trace of that ordinary person until there was nothing left to threaten. But if Leon's arc is about losing his humanity to competence, the next protagonist's arc is about never losing her humanity at all, no matter what the franchise threw at her. Claire Redfield. Claire Redfield arrived in Raccoon City on September 30th, 1998, the exact same night as Leon Kennedy. But where Leon at least had police academy training and a badge waiting for him, Claire had absolutely nothing. She was 18 or 19 years old, a college student, riding into a zombie-infested city on a motorcycle because her brother Chris hadn't called home in weeks, and she wanted to find him. That's it. That was the plan. Find Chris. Her entire survival toolkit consisted of lockpicking skills, some hand-to-hand combat Chris had casually taught her during family visits, and sheer stubbornness. No government clearance, no institutional backing, no special forces training. Claire Redfield is the franchise's most relatable young protagonist because she survived on pure adaptation. Every weapon she picked up, every puzzle she solved, every monster she outran, she was figuring it out in real time. But here's where her story becomes something more than just survival. When Claire discovers Sherry Birkin, the young daughter of Umbrella scientists William and Annette Birkin, everything changes. Sherry is infected with a G-virus embryo. She's a child, alone, terrified, and dying. And suddenly Claire isn't just trying to escape Raccoon City. She has an actual mission now. She has someone to protect. That emotional shift transforms her entire narrative, and honestly, it's the moment that defines her character for the rest of the franchise. After Raccoon City, Claire didn't slow down. By December 1998, she had infiltrated Umbrella's Paris laboratory looking for Chris. She got captured and transported to Rockford Island, where she met fellow prisoner Steve Burnside. Steve and Claire fought their way through the island together, and it seemed like they might actually make it out. Then Alexia Ashford happened. Steve mutated into a powerful creature under Alexia's control and died in Claire's arms. It hit her hard, really hard. Chris eventually showed up for what might be the worst family reunion in gaming history. The two siblings worked together against Alexia, though Chris handled the final confrontation while Claire escaped on a Harrier jet. And this is a pattern some fans have rightfully pointed out. Claire consistently gets positioned in a supporting role relative to her brother, despite being equally capable and arguably more emotionally compelling. Here's the thing, nobody wants to say out loud, but everybody knows. Claire and Leon debuted in the exact same game on the exact same night. Leon went on to star in Resident Evil 4, one of the greatest games ever made, plus RE6, plus multiple films and side stories. Claire's subsequent appearances were significantly fewer. The franchise never gave her the space her importance deserved, but what Claire did with her screen time matters. By the 2010s, she had joined TerraSave, a human rights organization focused on bioweapon survivors and bioterrorism response. Her work connected her to Leon and eventually to a 2013 US government facility that tried to exploit her expertise. institutional betrayal again. It shaped her into someone who navigated official bureaucracy while simultaneously doing underground humanitarian work because she learned the hard way that the system couldn't be trusted. Her consistent pattern tells you everything about who she is. Finding vulnerable people, Sherry Birkin, Natalia Korda, and protecting them while pursuing larger investigations, where Chris compromised his morals and Jill fought to atone for things beyond her control. Claire just kept showing up for people. No agenda, no government handler, just showing up. That's her whole arc, and it deserved more games than it got. But if Claire represents the heart of Resident Evil's protagonist lineup, the next character represents something entirely different. Something you can never fully trust. Ada Wong. Here's something that should bother you more than it does. Ada Wong has never been a primary playable protagonist in a mainline Resident Evil story mode. Not once. And yet she has shaped more critical plot events across more games than several characters who actually hold that title. She's not a side character. She's the invisible hand moving the entire chessboard. Let me explain. Ada was introduced in Resident Evil 2 as a mysterious woman claiming to be searching for her boyfriend in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. That was a lie. Her actual mission was recovering a G-Virus sample for an unnamed rival corporation. Her true employer? Never officially confirmed. Her true motives? Entirely her own. From the very first moment she appeared on screen, nothing about Ada Wong was what it seemed. And then there's Leon. The dynamic between these two in Raccoon City is one of the most fascinating relationships in the franchise because it's built on genuine connection and complete manipulation simultaneously. Ada saved Leon's life multiple times during the outbreak. She kept him alive when he had no business surviving, but she also absolutely used him. When the dust settled, Ada didn't stay. She departed Raccoon City with recovered bioweapon materials, extracted via hookshot helicopter arranged by Albert Wesker himself. She helped Leon survive. She also treated him like a useful asset. Both things are true. 6 years later in Spain, Ada resurfaced alongside Leon during the Los Illuminados investigation. This time she was hunting Dr. Luis Serra and Las Plagas samples. Here's where it gets interesting. Wesker directly ordered her to execute Leon. She didn't, but her betrayal went even further than simple disobedience. Ada obtained the dominant species Plaga specimen, the one Wesker actually wanted, and then sent him an inferior sample instead. She ran her own operation inside her official operation. That's not rebellion. That's a masterclass in autonomy. The Separate Ways DLC tracks her parallel objectives during RE4 and confirms something critical about her character. Ada maintained complete moral autonomy while embedded inside Wesker's organization. She chose which orders to follow based on personal principles, not institutional loyalty. Every other protagonist in this franchise is shaped by trauma, duty, or the organization they serve. Ada is shaped by nothing except her own judgment. That's genuinely unusual, and it's what makes her compelling. Now, Resident Evil 6. This is where things get absolutely unhinged. A clone of Ada Wong, created by Derek C. Simmons, was running loose during a global bioterrorism crisis, causing catastrophic damage. Ada spent a significant portion of the game dismantling the operations of her own doppelganger. Let that sink in. Her main antagonist was literally herself. A fake version of her was out there ruining her reputation, and Ada had to clean up the mess while simultaneously pursuing her actual agenda. It's chaos. Beautiful, ridiculous chaos. But here's the thing about Ada's evolution that separates her from everyone else on this list. It's not physical. It's not trauma-driven. It's a gradual clarification of personal ethics. She starts as genuinely opaque. You cannot tell what she believes or what lines she won't cross. By RE6, she's still mysterious, but the principles guiding her decisions have become legible. She will not kill someone she respects for an employer she doesn't trust. She will not hand the most dangerous weapon to the most dangerous man. She will operate in moral gray areas forever, but she will do it on her own terms. Ada Wong is the franchise's living proof that morally gray and principled are not mutually exclusive. And honestly, in a series full of characters defined by what happened to them, there's something refreshing about one defined entirely by what she chose. But if Ada represents the franchise at its most calculated and controlled, the next protagonist is the exact opposite. A guy with zero training, zero intel, and zero idea what he's walking into, i.e. Ethan Winters. Early early in Resident Evil 7, Ethan Winters gets his hand cut off, completely severed. And what does he do? He pours some first aid liquid on it, slaps it back on, and keeps moving. Every single player had the same reaction. Okay, that's just video game logic. Whatever. It wasn't video game logic. And the moment you realize that changes everything about this character, Ethan Winters is a systems engineer, not a cop, not a soldier, not a government agent. He has zero combat training and exactly one reason to be in rural Louisiana. His wife Mia disappeared 3 years ago, and he got a message suggesting she was still alive. That's the entire setup for Resident Evil 7, and it's the most grounded motivation the franchise had ever given a protagonist. The Baker family residence is where the horror lives. Not a corporate laboratory, a house. Jack Baker, Marguerite, their family, all transformed by Eveline, an artificial bioweapon whose mold infection twisted everything it touched. The horror is domestic, family dinner tables, hallways with family photos, and Ethan, this completely ordinary guy, has to survive all of it with whatever he can, scavenge from drawers and shelves. But here's where it gets dark. Throughout the entire game, Ethan takes damage that should kill him, multiple times. He reattaches that severed hand. He survives being impaled, beaten, and brutalized in ways no human body recovers from. The game never explains it. Not until Village. The twist. Ethan was killed by Jack Baker when he first arrived at the property. Before the player ever takes control, Ethan Winters is already dead. The mold had replaced every cell in his body. He wasn't healing. He was demonstrating what happens when the mold has a complete host. The entire game, you were playing as something that couldn't die the way a human dies, and neither you nor Ethan knew it. That recontextualizes everything. Resident Evil Village picks up 3 years later. Ethan is living in Eastern Europe with Mia and their daughter Rosemary. Mother Miranda, a shape-shifting superhuman operating for over a century, infiltrates their home and takes Rose. Ethan goes after her, through the village, through 4 lords, each controlling their own territory. Lady Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Salvatore Moreau, and Carl Heisenberg. Every single one standing between Ethan and his daughter, and that's what separates him from every other protagonist in this franchise. Chris fights for duty. Leon fights for his country. Jill fights to stop bioterrorism. Ethan fights for his kid. No mission briefing. No chain of command. Just, I am getting my daughter back. The simplest and most human motivation the series has ever given anyone. He succeeds. He defeats Miranda. But his body, the mold construct that kept him walking across 2 full games, is finally failing. And Ethan makes a choice. He stays behind. He triggers the explosion that destroys the Megamycete, knowing it will kill him. A mold-based being that was functionally immortal chose to die so his wife and daughter could live. That's not video game heroism. That's a father's decision. His consciousness didn't vanish entirely. In the shadows of Rose DLC, fragments of Ethan persisted within the Megamycete's biological archive. He appeared to his daughter one last time, guiding her from inside that network, not as a ghost, as a memory with enough love left to point her in the right direction. His arc is unlike anything Resident Evil had ever attempted. Everyman to posthuman to willing martyr, a guy who went looking for his wife and ended up sacrificing a body that wasn't even really his, anymore for a daughter who might not be entirely human either. Somehow, it's the most emotionally honest story the franchise has ever told. But Ethan's sacrifice didn't just end his story, it started someone else's. Rose Winters. Every protagonist we've covered earned their powers through infection, experimentation, or sheer bad luck. Rose Winters is different. She was born this way. Born August 2nd, 2020, to 2 parents already mutated by mold infection, Rose didn't become a bioweapon subject. She arrived as one. Superhuman cognitive and psychic abilities from birth, mold affinity encoded directly into her DNA. That's unprecedented. Every single protagonist before her had to be changed into something else. Rose just was. Mother Miranda recognized this immediately, targeting Rose as a vessel to resurrect Eva, Miranda's own daughter who had died during the Spanish flu pandemic over a century earlier. Miranda had spent all that time using the Megamycete to search for a suitable host body capable of bringing Eva back. Rose's power wasn't random. It traced through a hereditary network of mold-infected superhumans stretching across generations. But here's where it gets complicated. Having god-tier abilities doesn't mean much when you're a child. Growing up under strict government protective custody, monitored constantly, bullied relentlessly by peers who can tell something is wrong with you. During anxious moments, appearance, white substance visibly leaked from Rose's body. Impossible to hide, impossible to explain away. By adolescence, she described herself as hardly even human, the most powerful bioweapon the franchise has ever produced, and she wanted nothing more than to be normal. That desire is what drives the Shadows of Rose DLC, set in 2037, 16 years after her father's death. Rose voluntarily enters the realm of consciousness, the Megamycete's internal mental archive containing centuries of absorbed memories from every consciousness the mold has ever consumed. Her goal is simple: find the purifying crystal, destroy her powers, become a regular person. What she actually finds is a nightmare. Duplicate versions of herself, Eveline's remnant consciousness, the bioweapon from RE7, now existing as a kind of digital ghost haunting the Megamycete's architecture. Physical manifestations of her own trauma and self-loathing given form and teeth. The realm doesn't just challenge Rose physically, it forces her to confront every piece of herself she's been running from. And the purifying crystal she's been chasing? It was never a prize, it was a test. The entire system was evaluating her worthiness from the moment she stepped inside. Everything she endured, every choice she made, was being measured. Rose refuses to surrender her powers. She stops running from what she is and embraces it, uses her mold connection to destroy Miranda's lingering consciousness within the Megamycete, chooses to be powerful on her own terms rather than powerless on someone else's. Analysts suggest she may currently be the most powerful bioweapon in the entire franchise, potentially exceeding both Eveline and Miranda in raw capability. But her journey was never about demonstrating that strength. It was about whether she wanted it at all. But here's the moment that breaks you. The guardian angel guiding Rose through the realm of consciousness, the mysterious presence helping her survive every encounter, protecting her when she couldn't protect herself. It was Ethan, her father, his consciousness preserved inside the Megamycete's biological archive even after his death. The man who sacrificed everything so his daughter could live was still there, in the only form available to him, helping her one last time. He couldn't hold her, couldn't speak to her as himself for most of the journey, but he was there. He was always there. That's the emotional core of everything this franchise has been building toward in its modern era. A father who died for his daughter, reaching across death itself through the very biological network that took his life, just to make sure she'd be okay. Rose ends the DLC by joining Chris Redfield's operation, still under institutional monitoring, but now on her own terms. She's the franchise's newest protagonist archetype, a posthuman who chose her identity rather than having it imposed. She closes the loop on everything Ethan started, but Rose isn't the only character whose identity has been defined by choice rather than circumstance, and nobody in this franchise has made more impossible choices than our next protagonist. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.